Hey guys, tonight we're going to talk about something you've probably felt, but maybe never quite named. It starts small. A memory. A classroom. A woman raises her hand to speak in a philosophy lecture, and the room tightens. Not violently. Not obviously. Just slightly. Like the air forgets how to breathe for a second. Because here's the truth. For centuries, philosophy wasn't written for her. It wasn't even written to include her. You see, a girl can wear jeans, chop her hair short, play the rebel, the thinker, the stoic, and no one will say she's betraying her kind. But when a boy cries, softens, hesitates, when he takes on qualities long associated with the feminine, he's mocked. Because somewhere deep down, this world still thinks being female is being less. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And tell me, where are you watching from and what time is it right now? Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. We begin with silence. A silence that is deliberate, carefully constructed, and repeated across centuries. In the history of Western philosophy, women were not absent because they lacked intellect, imagination, or insight. They were absent because the very systems that define knowledge, reason, and authority were structured to exclude them. To speak, to originate thought, to be recognized as a source rather than an object of interpretation. These were privileges systematically denied. Women were transformed into metaphors, symbols, or problems to be analyzed. They were rarely allowed to exist as autonomous thinkers, and when they did appear, their voices were mediated, filtered, and interpreted through male frameworks. They were present everywhere, yet their agency was invisible. Their minds were recognized only in what they reflected about men. Consider Plato. In his abstract world of perfect forms, embodiment, relationality, and emotion, the qualities historically coded as feminine were subordinated to the universal ideal. Women appear in his works not as originators of thought but as illustrative figures, moral examples, or deviations to demonstrate philosophical principles. Abstraction itself was gendered. The masculine is central, rational, and authoritative. The feminine is peripheral, symbolic, and contingent. The ideal of knowledge requires distance from the body, from relational complexity, and from the emotional world. Philosophy, in this sense, was less about exploring human experience than about enforcing a hierarchy that privileged a narrowly defined rationality, structured along masculine lines. The experiences of women, their insight into relational dynamics, their moral imagination, were systematically excluded from what counted as legitimate thought. Schopenhauer institutionalized exclusion as dogma. He describes women as a deviation from nature, a weaker, lesser version of the male, destined for obedience. This is not merely casual misogyny, it is a structural prescription. By declaring women deficient by nature, he establishes silence as a principle, not a coincidence. Emotional depth, moral nuance, relational intelligence, qualities associated with the feminine, are reframed as threats or deficiencies. Women are defined as subordinate observers rather than active thinkers. Absence becomes not an error or accident, but a design feature of philosophical reason. Their capacity for independent thought is denied before they even speak. Nietzsche, on the other hand, casts women as disruptive forces, destabilizing clarity and rational order. You go to women? Do not forget the whip, he warns, embedding patriarchal anxiety within his philosophical narrative. Instinct, desire, and unpredictability, qualities that might generate insight, are coded as danger. Philosophy is constructed as a space where containment is necessary, where disruption must be controlled, and where women's lived experiences are treated as inherently destabilizing. Authority in this context is defined not only by what is included but also by what is excluded, ensuring that female thought is absent or managed to preserve masculine structures. Freud codifies this exclusion into scientific theory. He labels the female mind a dark continent, a territory to be explored, mapped, and diagrammed. Female desire, creativity, and anger are pathologized. Women are not thinkers in their own right, but objects to be studied. Their silence is dual. It conceals agency while simultaneously generating knowledge. Absence becomes methodology. Complexity is observed but never recognized as autonomous. Presence is transformed into charts, diagrams, and interpretive frameworks designed to neutralize autonomy. In Freud's work, the female mind is both present and inaccessible, known yet unreadable, understood only in relation to male authority. This imposed silence is structural and performative. Rationality, abstraction, and detachment are elevated. Embodiment, relational intelligence, and emotion are devalued. Clarity is defined as distance from feeling. Authority is measured by adherence to abstract principles. Anything too close to bodily experience, relational insight, or affective depth is excluded. Philosophy becomes a filter, recognizing only what conforms to predefined hierarchies. Vast territories of human knowledge, lived experience, relational nuance, moral insight, remain uncharted, invisible, or dismissed as irrelevant. Even when women appear in philosophical texts, they are often symbols rather than subjects. Pandora, Eve, Sophia, their presence is illustrative, relational, or moralistic. They serve to explain male dilemmas, fears, and desires. They do not originate thought. Simone de Beauvoir later analyzes this systemic othering. Women were defined relationally, existing primarily in reference to men, and rarely allowed to structure philosophical insight independently. Even when women wrote, their voices were confined to footnotes, marginalia, or exceptions, as if agency were provisional and contingent rather than inherent. Their thoughts were considered secondary or derivative. The social and psychological consequences are profound. Women internalized the modulation of speech, tempering assertiveness, softening opinions, and navigating social spaces where authority is risky. Men internalized the coding of empathy, relational intelligence, and emotional depth as traits that are potentially weak or devalued if displayed outside culturally sanctioned contexts. Silence becomes both a social norm and an internalized strategy for survival. Authority is performative, legitimacy is conditional. Silence instructs, shapes, and constrains thought. Structurally, this exclusion also shapes knowledge itself. Rationality is gendered, objectivity coded masculine. Knowledge is defined as measurable, repeatable, and abstract. Lived experience, relational intelligence, and embodied perception are systematically devalued. Absence appears coherent. Silence functions as authority. Knowledge reflects power priorities, not the diversity of human experience. What is excluded is rendered invisible. What is included is curated and sanctioned. Even within these silent spaces, traces of the feminine persist indirectly. Myth, allegory, literature, and cultural narrative carry suppressed insight. Feminist theorists reveal that the gaps in the canon are not accidental. They are the product of deliberate exclusion. Silence is never neutral. The frameworks that appear seamless are contingent, incomplete, and structured to maintain masculine authority. Feminine insight, even when marginalized, exerts influence, shaping culture, imagination, and collective consciousness subtly, persistently, and pervasively. The psychological dimension reinforces exclusion. Jung's concept of the anima captures suppressed feminine forces, present yet constrained, shaping intuition, creativity, and perception while denied formal recognition. Men reject relational depth, vulnerability, and emotional intelligence not only in women but also within themselves. Philosophical systems reflect defensive psychology. Stability is prioritized over nuance, control over complexity. Silence is both imposed externally and internalized as protection. Imagine a world where women always originated thought, never merely illustrated it. Where relational intelligence, emotional depth, and bodily knowledge are foundational. Authority would be contingent, objectivity situated, clarity provisional. Such a world would challenge hierarchies, disrupt established paradigms, and expand inquiry. It would be richer, more generative, and truer to human experience. Even when muted or marginalized, feminine insight leaves traces. Feminist thinkers highlight that absence is not a lack of intelligence but a reflection of systemic design. By mapping omissions and silences, they demonstrate that what appears missing is always potent. Absence becomes a site of revelation, marginalization, a source of insight. Female agency, once peripheral, emerges as central, capable of generating complexity, creativity, and depth previously unacknowledged. Silence, once imposed, is contestable. Absence, once normalized, can be disrupted. Women reclaim space, not as commentary but as origination. Authority is revealed as constructed, legitimacy conditional, and knowledge provisional. Inclusion transforms philosophy. Formerly ignored voices expand, complicate, and enrich what was considered complete. History, text, and knowledge are reframed. This chapter offers a foundational insight. Recognizing absence illuminates the structural dynamics of power. Tracing silence maps authority. Listening, finally, creates space for thought that was never meant to speak. Understanding systematic exclusion is the first step toward imagining philosophy as expansive, inclusive, and alive. Only by acknowledging what has been suppressed can we begin to envision thought in its fullest, most unbound, and most human form. In philosophy, women have always been present, but rarely as themselves. They appear not as thinkers, not as agents, not as subjects with desires or contradictions, but as concepts, metaphors, and illustrative tools. They are temptation, nature, chaos, mystery, always serving to illuminate masculine reasoning rather than asserting their own. Their lived experiences, emotions, and choices are systematically erased, replaced by images that fit pre-existing frameworks. The woman becomes a projection, a mirror, a cautionary figure. She exists everywhere on the page, yet her voice is never allowed to emerge fully, never allowed to shape the discourse as a source of insight in her own right. Consider the way classical philosophy treats the feminine. Aristotle, for example, reduces women to a state of incompleteness, a potentiality awaiting the active rational male principle. Nature itself, coded as feminine, is presented as unstable, relational, and unpredictable. Women, then, are not human subjects. They are the medium in which male thought unfolds. Their bodies, their desires, their intelligence, everything that defines a full person, is subordinated to philosophical expediency. Presence is guaranteed, autonomy denied. The feminine is everywhere in theory but absent in subjectivity. This pattern is not mere abstraction. It functions as a method of psychological control. By representing women as symbols rather than selves, male thinkers can explore desire, morality, and rationality without encountering the unpredictable force of real female subjectivity. Plato's dialogues illustrate this clearly. Women appear as examples, allegories, or questions that provoke Socratic insight, but their actual voices are mediated, filtered, and often silenced. They become instruments through which male reasoning exercises authority, never autonomous contributors to thought. The moral and emotional dimensions of women are likewise appropriated. In early modern philosophy, women are frequently cast as sources of temptation, irrationality, or disorder. Their passions are mapped, their influence analyzed, their desires dissected, but always as deviations from normative rationality. Autonomy is absent. Presence is instrumental. Abstraction here serves as a tool of control. By transforming women into symbols of threat or moral lesson, philosophy neutralizes their agency while maintaining the appearance of inclusion. To be present is to be objectified. To be represented is to be restrained. Psychologically, this has profound implications. To be turned into a symbol is to have one's desires, thoughts, and contradictions co-opted for someone else's reasoning. Women's internal lives, their anger, longing, intuition, are externalized, projected onto allegorical or symbolic constructs. They are objects not in the crude sense, but in the epistemic sense. Entities to be categorized, interpreted, and understood through frameworks that deny self-definition. Knowledge of women is conditioned upon male standards, and anything that exceeds or resists those standards is erased or rendered unintelligible. Nietzsche exemplifies this tension. Women in his texts are at once alluring and destabilizing. They are cast as instinctual, unpredictable, and disruptive, but never truly understood. Their power is framed as danger precisely because it cannot be contained within male conceptual systems. Philosophical womanhood becomes a mirror. Male fears, desires, and anxieties are projected, and the real woman is replaced by a symbolic form, an idea more than a person. She exists as challenge, as foil, as test, but never as a thinking subject with her own voice. Even mythology and literature follow the same pattern. Eve, Pandora, Helen of Troy, these women are rarely treated as full individuals with their own narratives. They are temptation, knowledge, chaos, a means to teach lessons or illustrate principles. Their lives are not recounted as autonomous stories but as instruments in male-centered logic. In this sense, women are omnipresent yet invisible. They are everywhere in discourse, yet forbidden from authorship, forbidden from agency, forbidden from being more than symbols. Feminist critique unmasks this dynamic. Simone de Beauvoir famously argued that women are defined as the other, never recognized as independent agents capable of originating thought. Their conceptualization stabilizes patriarchal knowledge systems by providing a consistent counterpart for male identity. Yet, as feminist theorists point out, the feminine cannot be entirely erased. Lived experience, relational insight, and intuitive knowledge seep through the cracks of abstraction, revealing the instability of supposedly universal frameworks. Absence, though structurally enforced, is never complete. The consequences of this conceptual framework ripple through psychology and social perception. Women learn early to modulate speech, to translate thought into forms acceptable to male authority, to measure expression against anticipated judgment. Men, in turn, learn to interpret, judge, and filter qualities coded feminine, empathy, relational intelligence, affective depth, through exclusionary frameworks. Authority becomes gendered, and objectivity is selective. What appears as clarity or rational rigor is, in fact, a system of controlled inclusion and systematic exclusion. Yet the space of the symbolic is also a site of resistance. When the feminine is revealed as constrained, mediated, and projected, its very persistence undermines male-centered authority. Julia Kristeva, Luce Irigaray, and others demonstrate that femininity cannot be fully neutralized. Language, thought, and symbolic structures reveal their limitations, exposing gaps through which real presence asserts itself. What was once treated as mere metaphor begins to insist upon reality. The symbolic facade begins to fracture, and the abstracted woman finds pathways into discourse. This insight illuminates broader dynamics of knowledge. What is considered rational, intelligible, or epistemically valid reflects structural authority, not neutral truth. To analyze how women are represented is to understand the construction of intellectual power. Who speaks, who is heard, and whose experiences are legible. Absence and abstraction are not accidental. They are deliberate strategies, mechanisms of control, and instruments of authority. The woman as symbol is simultaneously instructive, dangerous, and elusive. She embodies chaos that must be contained, emotion that must be interpreted, relationality that must be managed. She exists in philosophical texts and in the spaces they leave empty. And yet, despite centuries of mediation, women's creativity, intuition, and lived experience have never vanished entirely. These traces demonstrate the inherent incompleteness of systems that claim universality while excluding vast human domains. Symbolic representation is therefore neither neutral nor harmless. It is structural, performative, and deliberate. By transforming women into allegories, thinkers attempt to assert control, yet in doing so they expose their own anxieties. The unknowable cannot be fully contained, relationality cannot be fully abstracted, the other cannot be fully silenced. Feminist critique illuminates this tension, revealing the fragility of systems that claim universality while enforcing exclusion. Understanding women as conceptualized forces allows us to see how exclusion operates. It clarifies why women were denied status as autonomous thinkers, why their voices were filtered, misinterpreted, or silenced, and why philosophical authority has been historically gendered. At the same time, it demonstrates that the feminine, even in symbolic form, persists. These traces challenge the pretense of universality, revealing the constructed nature of authority and the gaps inherent in systems claiming to reflect all truth. The symbolic woman is a paradox, at once everywhere and absent, powerful and constrained, visible and muted. Philosophy constructs, projects, and mediates her, yet she refuses total erasure. Tracing this process exposes the structure of knowledge, the limits of authority, and the persistence of what was once thought peripheral. Within the cracks of mediation, feminine subjectivity survives, quietly subverting, asserting, and destabilizing. The chapter closes with an essential reflection. When women are rendered symbols, they are denied autonomy, yet their enduring presence reveals the incompleteness of knowledge systems. Concepts and ideas cannot fully contain the richness of lived experience. The symbolic woman, once thought only an instrument for male reasoning, becomes a lens through which we can see the fragility and contingency of all supposedly universal frameworks. In the persistence of her presence, the seeds of reclamation, resistance, and recognition are already sown. Philosophy has long exalted the abstract, the rational, the disembodied, yet it has done so at a cost that is rarely acknowledged. The systematic denial of bodily presence as a valid site of thought. And within this logic, or rather this psychological maneuver, women are consistently equated with the body. The reasoning is subtle, almost imperceptible, yet profoundly consequential. To be a body is to be flawed, to be too close to instinct, too entangled with desire, too susceptible to emotion. In many philosophical texts, the body is cast as an obstacle to clarity, a contaminant to pure reason. And because women were almost universally coded as bodily, their proximity to thought was always suspect, their insights always second-hand, always mediated. Consider the origins of this association. Plato, in his ideal forms, situates reason above all else. The world of the body is material, mutable, imperfect. Sensation, appetite, and passion are distractions from the eternal truths of the mind. Women, in these dialogues, are often represented as vessels of such distraction. They are not included in the arena of pure reasoning because they are too entangled with the mutable, the sensory, the corporeal. To be female is to be near the body, and to be near the body is to be seen as incapable of reaching the heights of disembodied clarity. This is not merely a historical curiosity, it is a psychological mechanism. By equating women with the body, male philosophers could distance themselves from qualities they found unsettling within themselves. Desire, vulnerability, intuition, and corporeal awareness are not abstract or impersonal. They are immediate and destabilizing. In projecting these qualities onto women, philosophers created a safe buffer zone between their own rational self-conceptions and the messy, embodied realities they might have recognized within themselves. The body became a boundary, a screen onto which anxiety, fear, and unacknowledged instinct were cast. Women became symbols of these internalized anxieties, the living repository of qualities that were at once feared and denied. Schopenhauer exemplifies this projection. He consistently depicted women as inherently tied to reproduction, desire, and the instincts of survival, framing their existence as subordinate to male rationality. It was not simply an observation, it was a judgment embedded within a broader defense of his own philosophical ideals. By declaring women naturally constrained to bodily concerns, he absolved himself of the need to engage with the full complexity of female subjectivity. Her body was not neutral, it was evidence of limitation, a barrier to intellectual equality, a visible manifestation of what reason must overcome. This philosophical strategy is not limited to individual thinkers. It is structural. Across centuries, the feminine has been repeatedly coded as corporeal, emotional, relational, and therefore epistemically suspect. The body becomes a heuristic. Proximity to flesh equates to proximity to the contingent, the subjective, the transient. And by extension, proximity to women equates to proximity to these same traits. Knowledge is abstracted from the personal, from the sensual, from the immediate experience. Authority emerges not from engagement with lived reality, but from distance from it. The body, and by association the woman, is a threat to this authority. Yet this coding of women as corporeal is also paradoxical. The body is never fully ignored, it is always present, always referenced, always measured. Women's bodies are meticulously observed, classified, theorized, and moralized. They are simultaneously invisible in intellectual terms and hypervisible in sensory terms. They exist as objects but not subjects. Their presence is a constant reminder of the inescapable corporeal reality that philosophy, in its aspiration toward universality, has tried to suppress. The woman therefore is both central and peripheral, omnipresent and denied, real yet abstracted into a symbol of limitation. Freud deepened this tension. In his psychoanalytic framework, women were conceptualized as the other, their psychological reality filtered through the lens of anatomy. The body was destiny, the visible proof of intellectual and emotional limitation. Female experience became a problem to be analyzed, charted, and interpreted. The richness of subjective life, anger, desire, creativity, ambivalence, was mapped onto anatomical difference, as though thought itself could be reduced to form and function. Here, the body is not merely a site of difference, it is a tool of epistemic marginalization. By framing the female body as a barrier to reason, Freud and his contemporaries reinforced centuries of exclusion, transforming lived experience into a theory of deficiency. Psychologically, the implications are profound. Women internalize the message that their bodies make them suspect, that their embodiment compromises their intellectual legitimacy. They learn to translate experience into forms acceptable to male-defined rationality, to moderate the expression of emotion, to hide instinctual knowledge in favor of socially sanctioned forms of reason. Men, in turn, are conditioned to interpret, measure, and filter bodily expression through exclusionary standards, evaluating clarity, creativity, and insight against norms that privilege disembodiment. Knowledge becomes gendered, and embodiment becomes the metric of disqualification. The consequences extend beyond philosophy into everyday life. Women's gestures, tones, and movements are scrutinized as indicators of credibility. Nervousness or excitement is labeled instability. Relational attentiveness is read as manipulation. Emotional expression is coded as volatility. Bodies are surveilled and interpreted as proxies for cognitive worth. Authority is performed against the backdrop of embodiment, and standards of rationality are enforced in ways that consistently disadvantage women. The body, which should be a source of insight and knowledge, is weaponized as proof of inadequacy. And yet, paradoxically, embodiment is also a site of resilience and insight. Where philosophy has sought to abstract, real experience persists. Intuition, empathy, affective awareness, qualities historically coded as feminine, allow alternative forms of knowing to emerge. The body, once treated as an obstacle, becomes a lens, a medium through which complex, relational, and context-sensitive knowledge can be apprehended. Here, women's presence disrupts the illusion of universality, revealing that rationality alone cannot account for the fullness of experience. Knowledge is inseparable from the lived, the felt, the embodied. This dynamic illuminates the broader problem of epistemic authority. If thought is defined in opposition to embodiment, then those closest to the body, women, children, the socially marginalized, are automatically excluded from authorship. Objectivity is constructed as distance from sensation, clarity as detachment from desire. Yet these very criteria expose their own limitations. By denying the body, philosophy limits itself to abstraction. By marginalizing women, it narrows the scope of legitimate inquiry. Authority becomes both fragile and incomplete, dependent on the erasure of what it cannot encompass. The resistance of embodiment is subtle but persistent. Lived experience, intuition, and relational awareness seep through theoretical cracks, exposing the inadequacy of male-centered abstractions. Feminist theorists have long emphasized that these qualities, historically dismissed as subjective or unreliable, are forms of intelligence. The body, when fully recognized, contributes to understanding, interpretation, and insight in ways that purely abstract reason cannot. The presence of women, inescapably bodily, demonstrates the limits of abstraction and the necessity of inclusivity in the construction of knowledge. It is here that the paradox of the body becomes instructive. Philosophy's attempt to deny or suppress corporeal reality inadvertently highlights its indispensability. Women's bodies, though coded as obstacles, serve as reminders of the complexity of thought, the depth of relational knowing, and the richness of experience that disembodied reason cannot capture. The body becomes a site of knowledge precisely because it is resisted, observed, and excluded. Its persistent presence undermines the pretense of neutrality and exposes the structural biases of intellectual systems. Moreover, this association between women and the body reveals much about the psychology of power. Those who define knowledge and authority often externalize their own instability, desire, and vulnerability onto the other. By projecting corporeal qualities onto women, male philosophers protect their abstract self-conception while maintaining dominance. The woman becomes simultaneously visible and invisible, present and absent, a repository of qualities feared, denied, or unacknowledged. Psychological defense, epistemic strategy, and social control intersect in a single conceptual maneuver. The lesson is clear. To understand the marginalization of women in philosophy, one must confront the role of the body. Women have been coded as corporeal to justify exclusion, yet the body itself cannot be fully silenced. Embodied knowledge persists, seeps into discourse, and challenges the structures that seek to erase it. Every gesture, Every intuitive insight, every relational awareness is a reminder that abstraction alone is insufficient. Thought is inseparable from the living, and women's presence insists on that reality. This tension between abstraction and embodiment continues to reverberate today. Women are still judged by proximity to the body, by how closely they conform to or resist culturally defined norms of appearance, demeanor, and affect. Yet the very act of inhabiting the body, of experiencing and expressing the world through it, becomes a mode of knowledge, an assertion of agency, and a form of critique. By existing fully, women destabilize the illusions of neutrality and challenge the authority of disembodied reason. In conclusion, the body, when too present, has historically been weaponized against women, denying them voice and authority. Yet this same presence is inseparable from insight, relational awareness, and lived truth. Women's embodiment, once a barrier in philosophical discourse, is now a site of epistemic richness and subtle resistance. To recognize the body is to recognize the woman as thinker, agent, and source. Her presence disrupts, illuminates, and teaches what abstraction alone could never capture. The very obstacle becomes the avenue through which knowledge is expanded, authority questioned, and philosophy made more complete. From the earliest roots of Western philosophy to the psychoanalytic frameworks of the 20th century, women have often been defined less by presence than by absence. Their danger, philosophers and theorists have claimed, derives not from action or intention, but from what is supposedly missing. Lack of reason, lack of order, lack of anatomical or moral completeness. These deficits are not neutral observations but instruments of exclusion, shaping the perception of women as inherently limited, deviant, or threatening. In this chapter, we explore how defining women by lack has functioned as both a conceptual and psychological mechanism, systematically marginalizing female voices and constructing a world in which their knowledge and agency are treated as secondary or dangerous. The tradition begins with Plato, whose dialogues established a hierarchy of reason that implicitly excluded women. In his Republic, the ideal city is governed by rationality, wisdom, and philosophical insight. These qualities are abstract, universalized, and disembodied. Women, Plato suggests, can participate only in proportion to their deviation from the assumed norm of male rationality. They are measured against a standard that already presumes deficiency, a standard that equates thought with detachment from bodily experience, emotion, and instinct. The result is a subtle but persistent message. The female is defined by what she lacks relative to the male ideal. Her absence in positions of authority, in theoretical formulation, in philosophical discourse, is justified as natural, as evidence of inherent limitations. This strategy of exclusion extends beyond Plato. Aristotle, too, codifies deficiency as defining. Women are naturally colder, weaker, more passive. Their bodies, he argues, are imperfect, incomplete versions of the male template. Reason, virtue, and moral authority are implicitly associated with the male form. The female form is cast as a vessel of potential but not actualized rationality. Even where Aristotle recognizes intelligence or capacity, it is always secondary, derivative, or mediated through male understanding. Absence becomes the metric of identity. Women are known not for what they possess but for what they are presumed to lack. Moving forward to the modern era, this theme persists, albeit in new guises. Schopenhauer's philosophical critique of women is notorious. He describes them as deficient in rational capacity, subordinate in intellect, and ultimately oriented toward reproduction and compliance. His argument is not merely observational, it functions as a normative judgment. Lack is transformed into a moralized and structural principle, a justification for exclusion from serious intellectual discourse. Women's absence from philosophical authority is rendered natural, inevitable, and even desirable within this system. Nietzsche complicates the picture. While he recognizes the force and influence of women, he frames it as dangerous precisely because it is associated with what he perceives as deficiency, instability, unpredictability, and disruption of clarity. The female becomes a locus of potential disorder, a symbolic repository of instincts that must be contained, mediated, or controlled. In this formulation, lack is not only definitional, it is threatening. The absence of the supposedly rational, disciplined, and stable traits attributed to men is recast as a source of cultural and intellectual danger. Freud intensifies the framework by embedding lack into anatomical and psychological theory. Women are defined by the absence of the penis, by the lack of particular organs or capacities, and by the deficits that emerge in relation to male-defined norms. This absence is never treated neutrally. It becomes a principle for interpreting their thoughts, emotions, and desires. The female mind, he contends, is a dark continent, an unknown terrain mapped entirely through presumed deficiency. Her anger is hysteria, her desire is aberration, her curiosity is a deviation from natural order. Lack becomes the lens through which every aspect of female experience is translated, categorized, and contained. The psychological dynamics underlying this definitional strategy are significant. Defining women by absence protects male authority by externalizing uncertainty, vulnerability, and fear. By projecting deficiency onto women, male philosophers and theorists could maintain a coherent self-image as rational, complete, and stable. Lack is, in this sense, both a mirror and a mask. It reflects internal anxieties about instability, corporeality, and emotionality, while simultaneously disguising the epistemic and moral limitations inherent in the system itself. The woman becomes a convenient repository for qualities that threaten the perceived purity and universality of reason. This pattern is not merely symbolic, it has material consequences. Women's absence from positions of authority, from intellectual institutions, and from the public sphere is rationalized as a reflection of their supposed deficiencies. Opportunities for participation, authorship, and recognition are withheld because the system treats lack as evidence of incapacity. Even when women demonstrate insight, creativity, or leadership, their presence is interpreted as exception rather than norm, anomaly rather than legitimacy. Lack, once encoded, structures not only perception but social practice, constraining what is possible and who is recognized as a thinker. The philosophical coding of absence intersects with broader cultural narratives. In law, literature, religion, and social convention, women's presumed deficits are reinforced, replicated, and ritualized. The notion of lack migrates from abstract discourse to embodied experience. Girls learn to internalize absence, to measure themselves against an ideal that already presumes their insufficiency. Women absorb cultural expectations that equate worth with compliance, emotional moderation, and invisibility. This internalization is subtle, cumulative, and profound. The epistemic exclusion of women becomes a psychological inheritance, shaping self-conception, ambition, and expression. Yet defining by lack is never a stable, uncontested process. Feminist and post-structuralist theorists, from Simone de Beauvoir to Luce Irigaray to Julia Kristeva, have challenged the logic of deficiency from within and outside the system. De Beauvoir famously declared that women are not born but made, by social structures, philosophical frameworks, and cultural expectations that define them as other. Irigaray interrogated language itself, revealing how it encodes and reproduces absence, silencing female voice before it can be expressed. Kristeva traced the return of what was excluded, the ways in which suppressed experience reasserts itself unpredictably, disrupting linear narratives of deficiency. These thinkers illuminate the fragility of the defined by lack framework. Absence is imposed, not inherent. It is a construction, not a truth. The philosophical practice of defining women through absence also reveals much about epistemic authority. Systems that codify lack present themselves as neutral, objective, and universal. Yet they rely on an unexamined hierarchy that privileges male traits and marginalizes others. Deficiency becomes a gatekeeping mechanism, a subtle but powerful means of controlling who can speak, who can be heard, and whose knowledge counts. Authority is not derived from merit alone. It is maintained through exclusion, through the framing of presence as threat and absence as justification. Psychologically, this exclusion shapes both men and women. Men learn to equate their identity with completeness, rationality, and disembodiment, while women internalize lack as a measure of self-worth. Desire, ambition, curiosity, and emotional complexity are filtered through the lens of deficiency, producing self-doubt, caution, and the pressure to conform. Yet paradoxically, the very quality that is defined as absence, embodiment, relational awareness, emotional resonance, becomes a source of resilience, insight, and alternative knowledge. What philosophy labeled as missing is precisely the dimension that allows critique, creativity, and new forms of understanding to emerge. In contemporary discourse, we see the ongoing legacy of defining by lack. Women continue to be measured against benchmarks shaped by male-centered abstraction, reason, detachment, clarity, and authority. Their presence in academia, leadership, and culture is often qualified, interpreted through narratives of exception, limitation, or compensation. Yet the critique of absence has also empowered new epistemologies, new frameworks that recognize difference not as deficiency but as source. The body, the emotional, the relational, once sites of exclusion, are now reframed as legitimate vectors of knowledge, insight, and influence. In conclusion, defining women by lack has been a persistent strategy across philosophy, psychology, and culture. It serves both as a tool of exclusion and as a psychological shield, protecting established authority by externalizing insecurity. Yet this very definition is fragile, contestable, and historically contingent. By tracing the logic of absence, examining its psychological underpinnings, and considering its cultural manifestations, we see not only the mechanisms of marginalization but also the potential for resistance and transformation. The danger of women, once imagined as lack, is now revealed as presence, complexity, and the refusal to be reduced to absence. Recognition of this paradox is essential. Absence as definition is not truth, it is a choice, a structure, a historically situated mechanism that can and must be challenged. What happens when the question is never about who she is, but about what she threatens? For centuries, some of philosophy's most revered voices didn't merely overlook women. They constructed them as symbolic disturbances. Not missing pieces of a puzzle, but splinters in the wood. Not unknown, but unknowable. Women were not only ignored by the system, they were designed to disrupt it, and thus condemned to the margins. Arthur Schopenhauer and Friedrich Nietzsche, two minds so widely cited, so deeply embedded in the roots of existential and modern thought, built their philosophical architectures by anchoring the feminine as a threat. Not as a co-creator of meaning, not as a legitimate thinker, but as a force that must be either conquered, neutralized, or mythologized. Let's begin with Schopenhauer, whose disdain for women is not a side note, but a central component of his worldview. In his 1851 essay on women, he does not veil his contempt. He writes, "Woman is by nature meant to obey." And if that weren't explicit enough, he adds, "Women are big children all their lives, a sort of intermediate stage between the child and the man, who is the real human being." Note that wording, the real human being. It's not just arrogance, it's ontology. He doesn't argue that women are lesser in experience. He claims they are ontologically incomplete. Women, to Schopenhauer, are mistakes of nature, driven by instinct, incapable of rational thought, lacking spiritual depth. He dismisses female intellect as mimicry, emotional capacity as excess, and autonomy as delusion. But this is not merely a misinformed 19th century rant. It's a strategy. By defining woman as less than, he creates a hierarchy where male thought is not only superior but unchallengeable. Schopenhauer needs her to be irrational because his system of pessimism demands an external disruptor, a force that drags the noble intellect down into the chaos of flesh and desire. And who better to blame than the woman? In Schopenhauer's hands, the feminine becomes a philosophical scapegoat, a living embodiment of chaos, emotion, and distraction. Not someone to be understood, but something to be warned against. His woman is not dangerous because of her power, but because she supposedly lacks it, and that lack itself is contagious. Now turn to Nietzsche and the tone shifts, but not the verdict. Nietzsche was more poetic, more elusive, but no less damning. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Nietzsche writes, "Are you going to women? Do not forget the whip." It's a line that has echoed through feminist critique for decades. Nietzsche later claimed it was meant as a quote from an old woman, not his own words, but context matters. The surrounding passages are equally revealing. Nietzsche portrays women not as inferior but as destabilizing forces, dangerous precisely because they operate outside the rational, outside the explainable. His version of the feminine is not weak, it's wild. To Nietzsche, woman is not the childlike being of Schopenhauer's mind, but the seductive siren who lures the thinker off his path. She's not shallow, she's too deep, a mystery that disrupts clarity. And because she threatens order, she must be excluded from it. Nietzsche's vision of the feminine is a mythic mask, woman as temptation, as chaos, as anti-logos. She becomes the other side of the Apollonian order he reveres, Dionysian, embodied, erotic, uncontrolled. In his framework, she is not excluded because she is irrelevant, but because she is too potent. But here's the twist. Potency in these frameworks is not empowering, it is disqualifying. And this disqualification is systemic. It's not just personal opinion, it's a philosophical maneuver. When a thinker defines reason as male and emotion as female, objectivity as masculine and subjectivity as feminine, logic as male and intuition as female, they are not making neutral claims. They are building a world where any trait associated with women must be marginalized. And since these binaries are never biologically inevitable, they serve as codes for power. This is where the deeper psychological insight emerges. Both Schopenhauer and Nietzsche are not simply afraid of women, they are afraid of what women symbolize within themselves. The philosopher sees in the woman not just the other, but the inner other. The body he cannot control, the longing he cannot tame, the tenderness he must repress to maintain his image of strength. She becomes the mirror that reflects his own instability, and so she must be shattered. This is classic projection. A defense mechanism where the mind displaces its own unwanted traits onto someone else. Schopenhauer cannot face the part of himself that doubts reason, so he casts that doubt onto women. Nietzsche cannot admit the chaos in his own soul, so he fashions woman as its personification. The rejection of the feminine is, at its core, the rejection of emotional complexity, of epistemological humility, of embodied truth. It's not the woman they fear, it's the collapse of control she represents. And here is the most insidious part. Once woman is defined as disruption, any attempt to speak, think, or claim space becomes self-defeating. She speaks? Then she's hysterical. She thinks? Then she's dangerous. She feels? Then she's biased. The very act of expression becomes proof of her unfitness. The system is closed. This isn't merely historical. It lingers. Even today, how often are women told to calm down, to be less emotional, to speak more rationally? How many female academics feel the pressure to masculinize their tone, to suppress warmth, to write in the dry, passive voice of detached reason? And when they don't, when they write from the body, the gut, the wound, they are accused of being too personal, not rigorous enough, or worse, irrational. The shadow of Schopenhauer and Nietzsche still falls across lecture halls and journal pages. Not because their texts are still quoted, but because their frames are still active. Woman as threat. Emotion as liability. Disruption as error. But what if disruption is not a flaw, but a function? What if women's historical position outside the canon has given them a unique vantage point, not tainted by tradition but sharpened by exclusion? What if the traits philosophy fears most, emotion, embodiment, relational knowing, are not philosophical failures but its long missing ingredients? This is what contemporary feminist thinkers like Julia Kristeva, Luce Irigaray, and bell hooks argue. They don't seek to politely enter the conversation, they seek to reconfigure it, to challenge not just the answers but the questions themselves. Irigaray, for instance, critiques how language itself is gendered, how syntax, metaphor, and structure all encode male norms. Female subjectivity, she says, has never been sufficiently thought. Kristeva writes of this semiotic, the prelinguistic, rhythmic aspects of communication often linked to the maternal, as a force that destabilizes fixed meaning. And bell hooks refuses the academic detachment of white male theory altogether, writing from the intersection of race, gender, and lived experience. They are not afraid to disrupt. They are disruption. And that's the point. To be disruptive in a system designed to exclude you is not a failure. It is a signal of your presence. It is evidence that the silence is breaking, that the tightly sealed room of male reason has started to echo with new voices. So let us return to Nietzsche's question. Are you going to women? Do not forget the whip. Perhaps the better question is, what are you so afraid of? A mind that dares to feel? A logic that dances? A philosophy that bleeds? The woman who disrupts is not dangerous because she lacks coherence. She is dangerous because she calls into question the coherence of a system that defined itself by excluding her. And maybe, just maybe, that system was never coherent to begin with. Emotions. The pulse beneath thought, the tremor beneath logic, the silent rhythm that weaves through every decision, every word, every hesitation. And yet, for centuries in the halls of philosophy, emotions have been the mark of weakness, of distraction, of incompleteness. Not for everyone, of course. Emotions have long been celebrated when expressed by men as passion, insight, or genius. But for women, the same pulses of the heart were transformed into suspicion, into irrationality, into threat. Why does a laugh, a sigh, a tear, a sudden flush of indignation render a woman untrustworthy? It is not a question of the emotions themselves, it is a question of the system that interprets them. Logic and reason, as defined by centuries of philosophical tradition, have been coded as male, abstract, and detached. The woman who dares to feel, to express, to inhabit her own experience fully, suddenly exists outside the permitted order. She is not a thinker, she is a phenomenon to be managed, read, restrained, corrected. This is not mere metaphor. Schopenhauer, Nietzsche, and Freud, all in their ways, constructed frameworks where the female emotional world was either pathological, corruptive, or dangerously opaque. Freud called the female mind a dark continent, a space to be mapped and conquered, its very depth suspicious. Nietzsche warned that the feminine, intertwined with instinct and desire, obscures clarity. Schopenhauer dismissed emotional expression as evidence of incomplete reason, a deficit to be feared and contained. In all three cases, emotionality itself was weaponized against women. The very act of feeling became proof of inferiority. Consider the way emotion is interpreted differently depending on whose body it inhabits. A man who shouts in anger is a revolutionary, a visionary, a passionate intellect unbound by petty restraint. A woman who raises her voice in indignation is hysterical, overreacting, unstable. A man who cries is profound, sensitive, able to access truths denied to stoicism. A woman who cries is sentimental, weak, incapable of objective judgment. The double standard is not incidental, it is structural. Emotion has been coded as inherently female, and by association, suspect. The philosophical consequences of this coding are profound. Knowledge, in the Western tradition, has been equated with detachment from the body, from desire, from affect. Reason is abstracted from lived experience. Objectivity is defined as emotional neutrality. The male thinker achieves universality because his emotions are assumed to be contained, transcended, or instrumental. The female thinker cannot claim universality because her emotions are assumed to be contaminating, misleading, idiosyncratic. Knowledge itself becomes a site of exclusion, a mirror reflecting structural biases. The result is that women learn early to mediate their own expression, to self-edit the pulses of their hearts, to translate their feelings into forms that are legible to the male-dominated canon. Calm down, speak more rationally, don't get too emotional. These are not merely social prescriptions. They are epistemic injunctions, ways in which the system enforces conformity to a standard that was never meant to include the authentic female experience. Emotion, far from being an obstacle to knowledge, is treated as its disqualification. And yet, emotions are inseparable from thought. Neuroscience tells us that emotion and cognition are intertwined, that decision-making, memory, and reasoning are suffused with affect. To strip knowledge of feeling is to strip it of context, texture, and consequence. But in philosophy, abstraction demanded the removal of this richness, and the feminine, coded as emotional, was thereby excluded. To inhabit one's feelings fully was to inhabit a space outside recognized authority. To think as a woman was to think dangerously. Historical examples abound. Hypatia of Alexandria, revered for her mathematical and astronomical insight, was remembered in some accounts as both brilliant and tragically vulnerable. Her embodiment of learning, her presence in public intellectual life, tied to rumor and sensationalism. Her intellect could not be disentangled from her gender, from her perceived emotionality, from the spectacle of her body in space. Likewise, women in salons and early universities were often described not in terms of their argumentation or insight but through the lens of charm, grace, or instability. Their emotional presentation was the primary frame through which they were judged. The tension between reason and emotion is also epistemic. Rationality has been culturally constructed as the pure domain of truth, a domain in which dispassionate evaluation is equated with reliability. Emotion, especially feminine emotion, has been coded as capricious, biased, and therefore unreliable. The consequence is epistemic injustice, the systematic undervaluing of certain knowers because of who they are and how they feel. Fricker, a contemporary philosopher, labels this testimonial injustice. Women's accounts are discounted, dismissed, or interpreted as tainted by sentimentality. The historical roots of this epistemic bias lie deep within the philosophical canon, encoded and perpetuated for centuries. But what is truly striking is the psychological dimension. Why has emotion, particularly female emotion, been coded as dangerous? Part of the answer lies in projection and control. Male-dominated systems of knowledge have long been anxious about the unpredictability of affect. A mind that feels is a mind that cannot be neatly contained, measured, or neutralized. Women's emotions, when expressed publicly or intellectually, reveal the limits of supposedly universal reason. They expose the fragility of systems built to appear coherent and rational. To silence or pathologize emotion is to maintain authority. This fear is not only external. Women internalize it. The cultivation of emotional restraint becomes survival strategy. A young scholar learns to moderate expression in seminars, to translate feelings into abstract terms, to mask frustration with polite phrasing. She learns that visibility of emotion can endanger credibility, even when the content of her thought is sharp and original. The system trains her not only to navigate exclusion but to anticipate it, to self-censor before censorship arrives. Yet the system's own contradictions are revealing. Emotions, when fully acknowledged and integrated, are powerful engines of insight. They provide access to moral judgment, to relational intelligence, to ethical nuance. Philosophers like Martha Nussbaum have argued that emotions are indispensable to practical reasoning, that fear, grief, and empathy enable understanding of justice and human flourishing. In other words, what the system feared in women, the capacity to feel, is precisely what enriches human knowledge when properly recognized. The feminist challenge, then, is both radical and restorative. It is radical because it refuses to sanitize or diminish female experience to fit pre-existing norms of detachment. It is restorative because it reclaims the epistemic authority of emotion, insisting that knowledge need not be severed from feeling. This is not merely a theoretical exercise. It is an ontological intervention, demanding that thought itself expand to accommodate the full spectrum of human experience. We can see echoes of this struggle across history. Christine de Pizan, defending the intellectual capabilities of women in the medieval period. Mary Wollstonecraft, arguing for rational education intertwined with emotional cultivation. Simone de Beauvoir, dissecting the cultural construction of femininity that pathologized emotional expression. Contemporary scholars analyzing the subtle ways affect shapes credibility, authority, and recognition in both academic and social contexts. In each case, emotion is neither incidental nor optional. It is the site of power, conflict, and liberation. And so, when a woman's feelings are labeled as excessive, when her response is dismissed as irrational, when her voice is judged through the lens of gendered effect, it is not an accident. It is the ongoing enactment of centuries of epistemic design, a reminder of the persistent tension between prescribed reason and lived experience. To resist is to claim legitimacy for feeling as a mode of knowing. To write, speak, or act with the fullness of emotion is to assert presence in a system that historically attempted to render women invisible, unreadable, and unsafe. Perhaps this is the quiet revolution that has always been underway, recognizing that emotional expression is not a liability but a lens, not a weakness but a form of understanding, not a threat but a tool. The challenge is not merely to survive within the constraints of abstracted rationality, but to transform it, to weave emotion into epistemology, to insist that clarity and complexity are not mutually exclusive. And maybe, finally, to understand that the woman who feels, the thinker who inhabits her emotional reality, is not too much or untrustworthy. She is complete. Her knowledge is whole, her perception expansive, and her voice necessary. The threat is not in her feelings, but in the system that has for centuries refused to recognize their value. Because when emotions are framed as danger, the real danger is to the status quo, the fragile edifice of a knowledge system that depends on selective silence. And by reclaiming her right to feel, to think, and to speak, she does not merely assert herself. She exposes the incompleteness of the world that tried to exclude her. The phrase dark continent evokes more than just geography. It evokes mystery, danger, and the unknown. It evokes a space to be mapped, tamed, and ultimately subdued. And yet, this is precisely how Freud, the towering figure of early psychoanalysis, cast the female mind. In his eyes, it was a terrain to be explored but never fully understood, a puzzle whose pieces could be catalogued and categorized, but whose full presence could never be acknowledged. She was not a subject in her own right, but an object of study, a sight to be analyzed, interpreted, and ultimately contained. Freud's language is blunt and unflinching. He described women as fundamentally incomplete, as having an inherent lack, a void, a deficiency that defined them from birth. Their psychology, he suggested, was opaque, elusive, and prone to irrationality. Their desires, fears, and conflicts were presented as problems to be solved, rather than realities to be engaged with empathetically. In this framework, listening to a woman on her own terms was neither necessary nor productive. The work of understanding her was undertaken not for her sake, but for the sake of male comprehension, the consolidation of male authority over knowledge itself. To enter Freud's dark continent is to confront a paradox. The more one seeks to map it, the more it resists simplification. Freud attempted to chart this territory using a lexicon of lack, missing organs, absent drives, incomplete development. Every symptom, every conflict, every neurosis was interpreted as evidence of deficiency. And yet, the very act of labeling women as deficient is itself revealing. It tells us more about the observer than the observed. Male authority demanded a landscape of gaps, because a woman who is fully present, fully intelligible, fully autonomous, would challenge the power of the mapmaker. Consider the notion of hysteria, perhaps Freud's most infamous concept. Hysteria was a diagnosis uniquely tied to women, a label applied to nearly every emotional or physical complaint that defied immediate understanding. In Freud's hands, the woman became a living diagram. Her body, her symptoms, her anxieties, all reduced to data points within a theoretical framework. Her suffering was dissected, classified, and interpreted, but rarely, if ever, truly heard. To be a woman in this context was to be transformed into a text, readable, interpretable, controllable, but never recognized as an autonomous mind. The metaphor of the dark continent also carries with it the suggestion of danger, of threat. A woman who thinks, who feels, who experiences, is potentially disruptive. Her inner life cannot be fully assimilated into the prevailing structures of authority. She is unfamiliar terrain, ungovernable by standard maps of logic and reason, a reminder that knowledge constructed in male-centric frameworks is always partial. In this sense, labeling her mind as dark is less an empirical observation and more a defensive maneuver. By codifying her as unknowable, the system preserves the illusion of control. There is, however, a psychological dimension beyond mere institutional control. Freud's construction of the female mind as mysterious and deficient mirrors the anxieties of those who fear the unknown within themselves. To encounter a woman's interiority is to encounter a world not fully aligned with one's own assumptions of order, predictability, and hierarchy. The dark continent is not only her mind, it is a reflection of the boundaries and insecurities of the observer. The act of defining, diagnosing, and classifying becomes a means of self-reassurance, a way to contain unpredictability and reinforce the structures of dominance. Yet despite this, the dark continent is not empty. It is rich, layered, and infinitely complex. It contains contradictions that resist categorization, desires that defy interpretation, thoughts that escape translation into abstract theory. Freud's failure, if anything, is not a failure of women but a failure of imagination and willingness. He approached the female mind as if it were a puzzle meant to conform to pre-existing notions of hierarchy, lack, and incompleteness. He did not listen for its rhythms, its depths, its unique logic. He imposed a lens designed to justify exclusion. The epistemic consequences are enormous. By framing women's cognition as inherently suspect, Freud and his followers established a precedent. Female testimony is filtered, their claims are mediated, their authority is conditional. A woman who speaks is always at risk of being interpreted through the diagnostic gaze. Her words are refracted, her meaning shifted, and her mind rendered perpetually other. Knowledge itself is constructed with her absence built into its foundation. To speak, then, is not merely to communicate, it is to risk reduction, misinterpretation, and erasure. The legacy of this conceptualization extends far beyond the clinic or the lecture hall. Consider the subtle ways in which women's insights continue to be discounted. In corporate meetings, scientific collaborations, or public discourse, emotional expression or nonconforming perspectives are often read as evidence of instability rather than legitimate insight. The echo of Freud's dark continent lingers, whispering that what is unknown must be dangerous, that deviation from the male-coded norm is suspect. Even now, women navigate the terrain of professional and intellectual life with the awareness that their interior worlds may be mistrusted, misread, or dismissed. And yet, there is a resistance embedded within the dark continent. Because it is mapped, it is not conquered. Because it is classified, it is not diminished. Women continue to think, to write, to innovate, to interpret. They reclaim the narratives imposed upon them, translating what was once pathologized into sources of knowledge, empathy, and insight. Writers, philosophers, and scientists alike have confronted the diagnostic gaze, exposing its limitations, its assumptions, and its embedded hierarchy. The once dark space becomes illuminated by lived experience, testimony, and creativity, forms of knowing that cannot be reduced to a schema of lack. The metaphor of the dark continent is therefore both a tool of oppression and a site of potential reclamation. To enter it is to recognize centuries of exclusion, but also to understand that knowledge is not the property of those who have historically defined it. Women's minds are not opaque because they are deficient, they were made opaque by a system designed to render them so. Each act of expression, each assertion of interiority, each claim to understanding, is an act of defiance, an expansion of the map in ways that cannot be contained by old frameworks. Moreover, the dark continent challenges the very assumptions of psychoanalysis itself. If understanding requires empathy, reflection, and engagement rather than imposition, then the female mind reveals the limitations of any theory that begins with deficiency. Her thoughts, feelings, and intuitions are not aberrations but contributions to the richness of human understanding. To approach her interiority with humility rather than authority is to broaden the scope of what counts as knowledge. The philosophical implications ripple further. If reason has historically been codified in opposition to what is deemed feminine, then to recognize the legitimacy of women's thought is to destabilize long-standing hierarchies. To acknowledge that the female mind is not an object but a subject, not a problem but a source, is to demand a re-evaluation of epistemic authority itself. Knowledge is not neutral, it is constructed, curated, and maintained. And for centuries, that construction has systematically minimized the voices of women. In this sense, the dark continent is also a mirror. It reflects the gaps, anxieties, and limitations of the systems that sought to control it. It reminds us that labeling, mapping, and diagnosing are acts of power, not purely acts of insight. And it reminds us, too, that reclaiming that space is not merely a matter of inclusion but of transformation. The terrain itself must be reimagined, its richness acknowledged, its perspectives integrated. By situating women as subjects of their own interiority, rather than objects of analysis, we begin to unravel centuries of epistemic injustice. The dark continent becomes a space of potential, a landscape in which women's thought can flourish without the constraints of imposed deficiency. It is an invitation to listen, to respect, and to engage with the mind as it exists, not as a pre-existing schema demands it to be. Thus, the female mind, historically diagnosed, pathologized, and rendered mysterious, begins to reclaim its authority. It refuses to remain the dark continent of Freud's imagination. It speaks, it theorizes, it interprets, and it contributes. The terrain may be complex, layered, and challenging, but its depth is a resource, not a liability. To encounter it fully is to expand the very notion of knowledge, to recognize that subjectivity, experience, and emotion are integral to understanding. Her mind is not to be conquered. It is to be recognized. It is not a puzzle for others' satisfaction. It is a source, a site, a power. Freud's dark continent becomes a testament not to deficiency, but to the resilience, intelligence, and authority that were always present, even when systems sought to deny them. Throughout the history of philosophy, science, and knowledge production, the word objectivity has carried an aura of neutrality, impartiality, and clarity. It is invoked as the ultimate standard, the measure by which truth is distinguished from error, insight from illusion. Yet this apparent neutrality is deceptive. Objectivity, as it has been historically constructed, is neither universal nor detached. It is deeply gendered, coded as masculine, and built upon exclusions that render women's voices peripheral, if not invisible. To understand the so-called impartiality of knowledge, we must first interrogate its foundations, uncover the invisible scaffolding, and see how power, preference, and history shape what is presented as reason. The masculine mask of objectivity is first and foremost a historical artifact. Consider the way classical philosophy treated reason as the defining characteristic of the human mind. Aristotle, for example, in his categorizations of men and women, positioned rationality as a male trait and subordination, emotionality and passivity as female. Logic, abstraction, and detachment became synonymous with the masculine. Feeling, embodiment, and relational awareness were coded feminine. These binaries were not neutral observations. They were normative, prescribing the boundaries of authority. The very act of declaring something objective implied alignment with these male-coded traits. To be dispassionate, abstract, and calculative was to be credible. To be relational, emotional, or embodied was to risk being disqualified. This is not simply a historical curiosity, it is a structural reality that persists across centuries. When men defined knowledge, they filtered it through their own lens, assuming that what they could understand and articulate encompassed the totality of human experience. Women's insights, particularly those arising from lived experience, from intuition, from relational or embodied knowing, were systematically rendered subjective, meaning irrelevant, unreliable, or secondary. The mask of objectivity served to protect and perpetuate male epistemic authority while discrediting any evidence or perspective that did not conform. One of the most striking elements of this system is its reliance on repetition. To appear objective, a claim must be backed by consistent patterns, measured with standards that are themselves historically coded. But these standards are not neutral. They repeat what has already been defined as valid, which historically meant male experiences and male reasoning. The effect is circular. Male perspectives are normalized as objective, and female perspectives are normalized as subjective. Any deviation from this loop appears as an anomaly, a problem to be corrected or explained, rather than a legitimate insight. Objectivity is thus less a measure of truth and more a mechanism of exclusion. Consider the scientific revolution and early natural philosophy. Figures like Newton or Descartes framed inquiry as detached, precise, and systematic. Their methods, celebrated as rigorous, implicitly assumed a worldview where the observer was neutral, uninfluenced by emotion or social context. Yet the very notion of detachment, of separating the knower from the known, draws on an abstract ideal of the mind, one historically coded as male, rational, and disembodied. Female scientists, philosophers, or observers were often seen as too immersed in emotion, too connected to the lived world, too bodily present to produce knowledge that could be trusted under these standards. Objectivity required a mask, and that mask was male. The mask is not only performative but also performatively violent. It silences, it erases, and it delegitimizes. To claim objectivity is to claim authority. To claim authority is to determine what counts as knowledge and who is permitted to produce it. Women's experiences, framed as subjective, are filtered out before they even enter the discourse. Knowledge systems appear impartial, but in reality they are built on layers of omission. Repetition reinforces legitimacy. Repeated male perspectives are treated as universal. Repeated absence of female voices becomes naturalized. Silence, in this context, is not absence. It is a deliberate structure, an enforced compliance with a masculinized definition of reason. Psychologically, this mask also serves as a defense mechanism. By framing women's insights as subjective or emotional, men, particularly those in positions of intellectual authority, distance themselves from aspects of knowledge that could challenge their own certainty. If female thought were treated as equal in rigor and relevance, the very foundations of their authority would be destabilized. The mask of objectivity, then, functions to maintain a sense of clarity and control. It transforms uncertainty, ambiguity, and relational complexity into a problem that can be contained under the guise of reason. It is as much about preserving ego and power as it is about understanding reality. The implications extend into contemporary scholarship. Peer review, citation practices, institutional hierarchies, and even the framing of research questions often carry the same invisible coding. Studies by male researchers are frequently cited as more authoritative. Women's research, particularly when focused on emotion, relational dynamics, or experiential knowledge, is deemed secondary or anecdotal. Journals, departments, and funding bodies replicate historical patterns, unconsciously privileging perspectives aligned with the masculine mask. Objectivity, far from leveling the playing field, maintains structural inequalities, masking them as rigor. The philosophical roots of this are visible in Kant, who, despite his immense contributions to epistemology and ethics, systematically excluded embodied and effective experience from the realm of rational moral law. Reason, for Kant, is universal, but universality is coded male, detached, abstract, impartial. The very notion that emotion or relationality could inform rational judgment was discounted. Women, whose experiences were inseparable from effective and embodied realities, were thus excluded from participation in constructing moral, ethical, or epistemic frameworks. Objectivity required that they be absent. Even in psychology, Freud and his contemporaries reinforced this pattern. Female subjectivity is pathologized, diagnosed, or rendered mysterious precisely because it cannot fit the male-coded paradigm of rationality. To engage seriously with female experience is to risk exposing the limits of supposedly neutral frameworks. The mask, therefore, must be maintained. Repetition of male norms and suppression of female voices ensure that the illusion of objectivity persists. Yet the mask has cracks. Feminist theorists, from Beauvoir to Irigaray to Haraway, have interrogated and dismantled its assumptions. They expose how claims of neutrality are often instruments of dominance, how disembodied reason is historically selective, and how exclusion is encoded as rigor. By revealing the gendered structure beneath the surface of objective knowledge, they challenge us to reconsider what authority looks like and whose voices count. Knowledge is not naturally impartial. It is socially, historically, and culturally constructed. Recognizing this does not weaken truth, it deepens it. The mask also illuminates cognitive biases. Humans, by nature, perceive through lenses shaped by experience, culture, and identity. Male dominance in knowledge production amplified these biases, transforming them into universal standards. When emotion, relational insight, or embodied experience is discounted, it is not because it lacks value, but because it threatens the coherence of male-centric reasoning. Objectivity, in this sense, functions less as a mirror of reality and more as a tool of selective amplification. The consequences ripple into daily life. In workplaces, academia, and public debate, women's observations are often challenged not on the basis of evidence, but because they are perceived as subjective. When men display emotion, it is often framed as passion or dedication. When women display emotion, it is framed as volatility or weakness. Rationality is gendered, and the masculine mask persists, shaping perception, interpretation, and judgment across generations. Yet, recognizing this structure opens the possibility of transformation. When objectivity is understood as historically situated rather than universal, knowledge can be expanded to include perspectives once deemed marginal or irrelevant. Listening to voices traditionally labeled subjective, valuing relational insight, and engaging with embodied experience are not threats to rigor. They are opportunities to deepen understanding. The mask is lifted not by rejecting reason but by interrogating its boundaries, acknowledging its coding, and inviting diversity into its practice. Ultimately, the masculine mask of objectivity is both a challenge and an invitation. It exposes centuries of exclusion and offers a chance to redefine what counts as knowledge. It reminds us that neutrality is never simply given. It is constructed, maintained, and defended. By unmasking it, we can create epistemic spaces where women's voices are heard, their experiences valued, and their authority recognized. Objectivity ceases to be a mask and becomes a tool of genuine inclusion, not exclusion. To confront the masculine mask is to confront the invisible scaffolding beneath centuries of thought. It is to acknowledge that what appears rational, dispassionate, and universal has often been anything but. And it is to recognize that true understanding requires listening beyond the mask, embracing perspectives historically silenced, experiences long marginalized, and voices never fully allowed to speak. Language is not neutral. It is a medium, a vessel, a framework for thought, and yet it is far from impartial. For centuries, women have been invited into conversation only on terms established by men. Their voices, their experiences, their desires, all filtered through a lexicon and syntax that predate them, designed for another mind, another body, another life. To speak in such a language is not merely to communicate, it is to navigate a landscape where the terrain is already mapped against you. Irigaray, one of the most profound thinkers of the 20th century, illuminated this structural betrayal. The moment a word is articulated, its meaning has already been coded with masculine assumptions. The act of speaking becomes a battleground, and the woman, whether she realizes it or not, enters a conversation where she is always slightly out of place. Consider the subtle ways in which this plays out in everyday life. When a woman expresses authority, she is sometimes labeled aggressive. When she expresses care, she is labeled emotional. When she asserts her desires, they are interpreted as manipulative. When she retreats, she is seen as weak. The words themselves carry the weight of a history that predates her, a history that has repeatedly excluded women from defining the very terms by which society evaluates competence, reason, and credibility. Every adjective, every idiom, every convention, preloaded, consciously or unconsciously, with assumptions that favor male experience. To speak is to risk misrepresentation. To remain silent is to avoid distortion. The stakes of language are existential. Irigaray's insight is piercing. Language is not simply a neutral tool, it is a carrier of systemic power. Meaning, she argues, is gendered before it is uttered. Words are already married to a structure that privileges the masculine, whether in grammar, syntax, or connotation. Consider pronouns, the traditional structuring of public discourse, the metaphors by which reason and virtue are framed. Masculinity is often synonymous with universality, neutrality, and rationality. Femininity is coded as specific, particular, or partial. This is not incidental. It is the hidden architecture of exclusion. Women, therefore, must constantly translate, negotiate, and reinterpret just to be understood within the terms of a system not designed to recognize them. This betrayal is not only practical but psychological. It creates a perpetual tension between self-expression and comprehension. When language frames the categories by which one can exist and be understood, it shapes the very contours of thought. Women are forced into a dual consciousness. They inhabit their own experiences while simultaneously anticipating how these experiences will be filtered, distorted, or devalued by a linguistic system designed without them. This phenomenon resonates deeply with Du Bois' concept of double consciousness, though in a gendered sense. One is always negotiating between the self as experienced and the self as legible to the dominant system. Philosophically, this is a radical challenge. Traditional epistemology assumes that knowledge is transmitted clearly through language, that ideas can be faithfully expressed, and that reasoned argument can bridge minds. Yet if the vessel of expression is already skewed, if words themselves carry coded assumptions, then the very possibility of neutral communication is compromised. Women's insights, particularly those grounded in experience, relational awareness, and embodiment, are at risk of being misread or minimized. It is not a lack of clarity or rigor on their part. It is the structural limitations of the medium itself. Language betrays her before she even begins. The consequences extend into literary, legal, and scientific discourses. In law, for example, women's testimonies have historically been questioned, reinterpreted, or discounted because the linguistic forms available to them were deemed improper, unclear, or emotional. In literature, women authors have often had to invent pseudonyms, masculine personas, or coded strategies to ensure their work is taken seriously. In science, the framing of research questions, the interpretation of data, and the peer review process all rely on linguistic conventions that have historically been male-coded. In each case, the betrayal of language is not a glitch. It is systematic, structural, and enduring. The philosophical ramifications are profound. Thinkers from Aristotle to Kant assumed universality in reasoning, but universality was equated with masculinity. When women attempted to challenge, reinterpret, or contribute, their language was interpreted through the lens of male normativity. The system absorbs what it can translate into its terms and marginalizes what it cannot. As Irigaray observed, this is a battlefield not only over meaning but over existence. If your words are continuously filtered, your experience continuously reframed, your authority continuously questioned, can you truly occupy intellectual space? Irigaray also points to the paradoxical nature of this betrayal. It is invisible precisely because it is foundational. We tend to assume that words are fair carriers of thought, that syntax and grammar are neutral scaffolds. Yet for centuries, these structures were coded to preserve existing hierarchies. The masculine mask of objectivity, as explored earlier, intersects here. Objectivity is linguistically, philosophically, and socially constructed to favor certain expressions of thought, those coded as male. Women's alternative expressions, their effective reasoning, their relational logic, are often seen as deviations, errors, or noise. Their language is policed not by intent, but by systemic expectation. The act of speaking, then, becomes an act of negotiation and resistance. Women must weigh clarity against authenticity, simplicity against complexity, conformity against truth. Every sentence is a choice, to fit into the system or to risk being misread, dismissed, or silenced. The stakes are high and the burden is unacknowledged. Where men can assume that language will accurately transmit their thought, women must anticipate translation, anticipate distortion, anticipate misrepresentation. Their voices enter a pre-coded system that bends, filters, and constrains them. Historical examples abound. Christine de Pizan in the late Middle Ages wrote explicitly to defend women's intellectual capacity, navigating a linguistic landscape saturated with misogynistic tropes. Her words had to counteract centuries of assumptions embedded in the very structure of language. Mary Wollstonecraft, centuries later, faced a similar challenge. Advocating for women's rationality and education required not only compelling argument but careful attention to tone, diction, and rhetorical framing. Their experiences reveal the insidious ways language can betray intention, even when the speaker is skilled and deliberate. The betrayal also has cognitive consequences. When one is constantly aware that one's words may be misread or discounted, it alters thought itself. Self-censorship, anticipatory framing, and internalized doubt emerge, not because of deficiency but because the linguistic terrain is adversarial. Women internalize the limits of language as limits of themselves, even as those limits are externally imposed. The battlefield is internalized, making the struggle invisible yet deeply felt. Yet even within these constraints, women find ways to resist, innovate, and transform. Irigaray emphasizes creativity, multiplicity, and the reconfiguration of syntax and expression. By inventing linguistic spaces that resist male coding, by experimenting with metaphor, rhythm, and narrative form, women destabilize assumptions embedded in language. The act of speaking becomes an act of insurgency, a reclamation of space and authority. Words are no longer merely vessels, they become tools of transformation. The interplay of gendered language and power is further illustrated in contemporary contexts. Academic publishing, legal testimony, media discourse, and even social media interactions reveal that language is never neutral. Titles, descriptors, and adjectives often encode subtle biases. Women's arguments are framed as tentative, cautious, or effective, while men's are framed as assertive, authoritative, or rational. The betrayal persists, not through overt censorship but through structural linguistic norms that shape perception. Psychologically, the impact is profound. Women learn to navigate a world where clarity is conditional, comprehension is filtered, and authority is linguistically mediated. The betrayal is intimate. It penetrates thought, perception, and self-conception. Yet it also opens a space for ingenuity, for strategic engagement, for critical awareness. By understanding the gendered structures of language, women gain insight into both the limits imposed upon them and the possibilities for reclaiming agency. In conclusion, the betrayal of language is not a matter of silence. It is a matter of systemic coding, a battlefield where expression, meaning, and authority are contested. Women are not incapable of articulation. They are constrained by a linguistic inheritance structured to marginalize them. Irigaray's insight that meaning is gendered before it is spoken illuminates the stakes of every conversation, every sentence, every act of expression. The challenge and the opportunity is to speak knowing the terrain, to find paths through the structural bias, and to reshape language itself to recognize women as full subjects, not objects, not metaphors, not deviations. To recognize this is to confront centuries of embedded assumptions, to understand that words carry histories, and to act with awareness that language is both weapon and shield. The act of speaking becomes revolutionary. Each sentence asserts presence, claims authority, and challenges a system that has long attempted to preemptively define and limit women's expression. By reclaiming linguistic agency, women transform both thought and reality, rewriting not only what can be said but who is permitted to say it. Throughout history, women's expressions of pain, anger, or resistance have rarely been taken at face value. Instead, they have been pathologized, reinterpreted, and often weaponized against them. One of the most striking examples of this phenomenon is the diagnosis of hysteria, a term that has haunted medical, psychological, and cultural discourses for centuries. At first glance, hysteria may appear as a clinical category, a neutral label meant to describe a set of symptoms. But beneath its veneer of objectivity lies a deeply gendered mechanism of control, one that simultaneously delegitimizes women's experiences, reinforces patriarchal authority, and structures knowledge itself around male norms. The etymology of hysteria is revealing. It derives from the Greek word hystera, meaning uterus. From its very inception, the condition was defined in direct relation to women's bodies. Female physiology became both the locus and justification of perceived pathology. Emotions, desires, and reactions that deviated from socially sanctioned norms were interpreted not as authentic experiences, but as manifestations of a defective female constitution. A woman's nervousness, irritability, or dissatisfaction was never merely a personal or situational response. It was construed as evidence of inherent imbalance, of bodily deficiency, of innate danger. The symptom was the body, and the body was always female. Consider the work of Hippocrates and Galen, early medical authorities who linked the uterus to a host of emotional and mental disturbances. Galen claimed that the uterus could wander through the body, displacing organs and producing a range of symptoms, from fainting and anxiety to sexual desire. The very idea that a woman's anatomy could induce madness became entrenched in medical reasoning for centuries. What is striking is how these interpretations transformed social resistance into pathology. A woman who protested, questioned, or expressed discomfort was construed as diseased, rather than simply human. Her mind was inseparable from her body, and her body, in turn, was always suspect. Fast forward to the 19th and early 20th centuries, and hysteria remained central to psychiatric theory. Figures like Jean-Martin Charcot, Pierre Janet, and Sigmund Freud engaged extensively with the diagnosis, observing, categorizing, and theorizing women's emotional expressions. Freud, in particular, framed hysteria as a window into female sexual repression and unconscious conflict. Yet even as he purported to understand women, he simultaneously transformed their experiences into objects of study, turning pain into theory and rebellion into pathology. In Freud's model, a woman's suffering was rarely her own. It existed primarily as evidence of unconscious deficiency or deviation from masculine norms. Her voice, again, became subordinate to interpretation imposed by male authority. Hysteria functioned as more than a medical label, it was a social tool. It codified expectations of female behavior: emotional, compliant, restrained. When a woman's affect exceeded the boundaries of acceptability, her deviation was medicalized rather than acknowledged as rational or justified. Anger became illness, sorrow became pathology, assertiveness became evidence of instability. The label reinforced a cultural narrative in which women were inherently fragile, overly sensitive, and dangerously unpredictable. By defining them as prone to hysteria, society could justify containment, control, and correction. Resistance was medicalized, dissent was pathologized, and individuality became subsumed under a diagnostic rubric. The psychological mechanics of hysteria are illuminating. At their core lies projection and displacement. Male authority figures, doctors, philosophers, judges, were tasked with interpreting female behavior, often while denying or repressing their own anxieties, insecurities, or contradictions. By projecting instability onto women, men could maintain the illusion of rational, orderly, and superior masculinity. Women's bodies became screens upon which male fears and uncertainties were inscribed, transformed into a system of control that appeared scientific, objective, and unquestionable. Hysteria also exemplifies the intersection of gender, emotion, and epistemology. Women's experiences, grounded in embodiment and relational awareness, were treated as unreliable data. Their self-reports were filtered through a lens that assumed deficiency. This filtering had epistemic consequences. The knowledge produced about women was simultaneously produced by women's marginalization. What was deemed objective, psychiatric observation, clinical diagnosis, psychological theory, was in fact embedded in a gendered hierarchy of credibility. Women's authority over their own experience was systematically denied. The truth of their emotions became inseparable from male interpretation, forever mediating their own access to self-understanding. Cultural narratives reinforced this medicalization. Literature, theater, and popular media depicted women as hysterical, irrational, and emotionally unstable. Charlotte Perkins Gilman's The Yellow Wallpaper is an illustrative example, portraying a woman confined and infantilized under the guise of treating her mental illness. The narrative exposes the subtle violence of hysteria as both a diagnosis and a social expectation. The protagonist's genuine needs and insights are repeatedly negated, her attempts at autonomy pathologized. Fiction mirrored reality, shaping collective assumptions about women's rationality, emotionality, and trustworthiness. The diagnosis of hysteria also intersects with class, race, and access to power. Elite women, whose behaviors threatened domestic or social hierarchies, were more likely to be scrutinized and constrained under medical authority. Working-class women's suffering was often disregarded entirely, or dismissed as vulgarity, further entrenching a double standard. In all cases, hysteria functioned as a mechanism to enforce conformity, to maintain structures that privileged male control, and to render women's bodies and minds legible only through pre-established frameworks. The persistence of hysteria in contemporary thought is notable. While the term is rarely used clinically today, its residues linger in subtle, pervasive ways. Women whose anger, grief, or assertiveness is labeled emotional, overreactive, or sensitive are experiencing a modern echo of the same structural patterns. Discrediting women's emotional responses continues to serve as a method of marginalization, shaping professional, academic, and social landscapes. The historical diagnosis, while formally retired, has bequeathed a linguistic and cognitive architecture that remains operative. Psychologically, the effects are profound. Women internalize the expectation of containment, learning to censor, moderate, or qualify their expressions to avoid social or professional repercussions. Anger is felt but suppressed. Grief is processed privately. Dissent is strategic. The internalization itself perpetuates the cycle, creating a subtle yet powerful form of self-regulation informed by centuries of cultural and medical precedent. Even when explicit control is absent, the internalized diagnostic lens shapes thought, affect, and action. Critical feminist theory illuminates the subversive potential within this history. By examining the structural and symbolic functions of hysteria, scholars reveal that the diagnosis was never merely about individual pathology. It was about social order, gendered power, and epistemic authority. Hysteria served to legitimate the authority of men over women's bodies, minds, and experiences. Recognizing this allows contemporary women to reclaim agency over emotion, narrative, and self-definition. Awareness becomes resistance. Speaking, feeling, and asserting can be acts of reclamation, challenging centuries of imposed pathology. Furthermore, hysteria exposes the broader mechanisms by which knowledge is gendered. When women's reactions are consistently interpreted as flawed, Their input in philosophical, scientific, and political debates is systematically diminished. The epistemic consequences are staggering. Entire bodies of experience, embodied, relational, affective, are excluded from the construction of truth. Male-centric rationality becomes the standard, while the voices, perspectives, and insights of women are rendered secondary, suspect, or irrelevant. To dismantle these inherited structures, contemporary scholarship emphasizes the necessity of listening, validating, and integrating women's emotional experiences as legitimate data. Emotional expression is not inherently unreliable or pathological. It is a lens through which to understand cognition, motivation, and social dynamics. By reclaiming authority over emotion, women resist the epistemic limitations imposed by historical diagnoses. They challenge the very foundations upon which patriarchal knowledge was built, refusing to allow centuries of misinterpretation to define their reality. Historically and psychologically, hysteria is thus far more than a diagnosis. It is a metaphor for the ongoing negotiation of authority, credibility, and selfhood in gendered contexts. Women's anger, suffering, and resistance were never merely personal. They were interpreted, reframed, and regulated to maintain systems of power. The label hysterical encapsulates the intersection of medical authority, cultural narrative, and gendered control. Understanding its mechanisms illuminates how deeply structural biases can infiltrate both individual experience and collective understanding. In conclusion, hysteria represents a profound example of how emotion, gender, and power intersect. It is a testament to the ways in which women's voices have been constrained, their experiences mediated, and their authority denied. Recognizing this history is not only an act of intellectual clarity but also of ethical responsibility. It demands that we critically examine how contemporary practices may continue to echo these patterns, and how reclaiming emotional authority becomes a crucial component of broader epistemic and social justice. Women's anger is not pathology. Women's grief is not pathology. Women's resistance is not pathology. These truths, when acknowledged, unravel centuries of imposed silence, revealing the structural mechanisms that sought to define them, and affirming the possibility of voice reclaimed. From the earliest days of philosophy to contemporary scientific discourse, there has been a persistent tension between abstract thought and embodied experience. Knowledge has long been idealized as something that exists apart from the body, a realm of pure reason untouched by flesh, emotion, or desire. And yet, the very act of removing the body from epistemology carries profound consequences. It is not merely a technical choice or methodological convenience. It is a deliberate structuring of what counts as credible, what counts as objective, and ultimately what counts as knowledge at all. In this process, women, and the experiences that are inseparable from their embodied existence, have been systematically marginalized, discounted, and rendered peripheral. This chapter explores the deep structural forces behind that marginalization, examining how the disembodiment of knowledge has historically erased women's perspectives and continues to shape epistemic authority today. At the heart of this dynamic is a philosophical bifurcation: reason versus body, mind versus flesh, abstraction versus experience. Classical thinkers such as Plato idealized the realm of forms, a world where the body was a distraction, a contaminant that interfered with the pursuit of truth. The soul, in its ascent toward knowledge, had to leave behind the messy, fluctuating, unpredictable body. This conceptual framework, ostensibly about the pursuit of clarity and universality, had a hidden consequence. It implicitly coded the body, and everything culturally associated with it, as suspect. And in the gendered imagination of the time, the body was rarely abstracted in neutral terms. It was overwhelmingly coded as female. The female body, in its permeability, in its cycles, in its capacity for birth, emotion, and desire, became the emblem of distraction, the corporeal anchor that tethered thought to uncertainty. This linkage was neither neutral nor accidental. It served a structural purpose. By associating embodiment with female otherness, men could claim authority over knowledge while simultaneously justifying the exclusion of women from the intellectual sphere. Knowledge became defined not by the richness of experience or the depth of insight but by the ability to distance oneself from the body, to claim a disembodied perspective. Men who were culturally positioned to be considered the default rational subjects could step into this abstracted realm with apparent neutrality, while women's insights, inseparable from embodied life, were labeled subjective, emotional, or anecdotal. To be disembodied was to be credible, to be embodied was to be suspect. Consider the scientific methods that emerged during the Enlightenment. Experiments, observation, and rational deduction were framed as the gold standard of knowledge production. Yet these methods often required a detachment that was culturally coded as masculine. Women's embodied experiences, menstruation, childbirth, fatigue, sexual desire, emotional response, were deemed inconsistent, idiosyncratic, and therefore unfit for serious inquiry. Even when women's experiences were studied, they were filtered through a male lens, stripped of context, or reduced to variables and experimental models designed to neutralize their corporeal specificity. The body was only legible when rendered abstract, quantified, and depersonalized, and the female body was particularly prone to being rendered a cautionary tale of excess, instability, or deviation. This epistemic marginalization also carries a psychological dimension. The rejection of the body is not simply an external imposition. It reflects deep-seated anxieties about instability, desire, and vulnerability. By disassociating from the body, male philosophers and scientists could cultivate an image of rational mastery and impersonal authority. Female embodiment, in its dynamism and unpredictability, threatened this image. Women's experiences, of pleasure, pain, intuition, and emotional resonance, revealed that knowledge is not purely abstractable, that cognition is inseparable from the lived, felt, and situated self. To confront this reality was to confront one's own limitations, uncertainty, and contingency. It is perhaps no coincidence that many historical thinkers responded by pathologizing or dismissing the embodied female experience rather than integrating it. A particularly vivid illustration of this dynamic appears in early modern medicine. Midwives' knowledge of childbirth, for example, was extensive and empirically grounded, rooted in decades of observation, practice, and attention to the body's subtleties. Yet as medical institutions became professionalized, male physicians dismissed midwives' expertise as anecdotal, informal, and unscientific. The very same phenomena, observed and understood in embodied practice, were devalued simply because the observer was female. Knowledge that arose from the body was considered inferior to knowledge extracted through abstracted, objective procedures. The epistemic lens had been calibrated to favor disembodied authority, not the intricate, relational intelligence embedded in lived experience. Philosophically, this creates a recursive problem. The very criteria used to define knowledge are themselves products of a system that marginalizes embodiment. Objectivity, rigor, and universality are construed as ideals, but their historical emergence was intertwined with the exclusion of certain perspectives. Women's experiences were labeled subjective not because they lacked insight, but because the frameworks for assessing credibility were designed to exclude them. Rationality and abstraction became measures of epistemic worth precisely by construing the body, and by extension female experience, as irrelevant or distorting. Contemporary feminist epistemology has challenged these assumptions in profound ways. Scholars such as Donna Haraway, Sandra Harding, and Evelyn Fox Keller have argued that knowledge cannot be disentangled from the positionality of the knower. Embodied experience is not noise, it is signal. By incorporating diverse perspectives, including those historically excluded due to gendered assumptions, epistemology becomes richer, more nuanced, and more capable of capturing the complexities of the world. Female experience, once dismissed as unreliable, is increasingly recognized as a source of unique insight precisely because it reveals the blind spots of supposedly neutral frameworks. Consider the implications for everyday life. When knowledge systematically discounts the body, it shapes social, professional, and educational hierarchies. Women are socialized to question the validity of their own perceptions, to defer to expertise that may be fundamentally partial or biased. Their voices in boardrooms, laboratories, or classrooms are often met with skepticism when they draw on embodied understanding. The very act of trusting one's own perception, of asserting experience as credible, becomes a form of resistance against epistemic norms that have long excluded them. The disembodiment of knowledge also has profound cultural consequences. Literature, media, and education frequently valorize abstract reasoning while devaluing emotional intelligence, relational awareness, and sensory perception. Women, whose contributions have historically been entangled with these modes of knowing, find themselves systematically underrepresented in shaping intellectual and cultural narratives. Knowledge, when constructed in abstraction from the body, loses its capacity to account for complexity, variability, and lived reality. The objective picture is incomplete precisely because it has been constructed to exclude certain experiences. Psychologically, the consequences of this exclusion are subtle yet pervasive. Women internalize messages that their experiences are peripheral, that the truth of their perception is secondary to the codified authority of others. This internalized doubt influences behavior, decision-making, and self-conception, reinforcing the structural marginalization imposed by historical epistemologies. Yet it also creates the conditions for profound insight. Awareness of one's exclusion provides the foundation for critical reflection, advocacy, and epistemic innovation. Recognizing that knowledge has forgotten the body allows women to reclaim both authority and agency. The tension between abstract knowledge and embodied experience is not solely a historical artifact. It is present in contemporary science, technology, and philosophy. Artificial intelligence, for instance, often encodes patterns learned from datasets shaped by historical exclusions. Bias in algorithms, predictive models, and decision-making systems reflect centuries of epistemic choices that rendered certain experiences invisible. Understanding how the erasure of embodiment underpins these systems is crucial to developing knowledge structures that are genuinely inclusive, robust, and reflective of diverse lived realities. In sum, forgetting the body is never neutral. It is an epistemic strategy that has historically rendered female experience marginal, subjective, and unreliable. It is both psychological and structural. A mechanism to sustain authority, to protect abstracted reason from the messiness of living, and to maintain gendered hierarchies in knowledge production. Recognizing this allows us to interrogate not only historical practices but also contemporary assumptions about what counts as credible, valid, and authoritative. By reintegrating the body into our understanding of knowledge, we challenge centuries of epistemic exclusion and reclaim the full scope of human experience. Women's experiences, far from being peripheral, provide essential insight into the dynamics of knowledge itself. Pain, emotion, intuition, and relational awareness are not barriers to truth. They are pathways through which understanding deepens. When knowledge forgets the body, it forgets the full human condition. When it recalls it, it awakens to the richness, complexity, and depth of experience that has been marginalized for too long. Ultimately, reclaiming embodied knowledge is not merely a feminist endeavor. It is a reconstitution of epistemology, a restoration of balance between abstraction and experience, reason and feeling, theory and the lived reality of human life. By acknowledging the centrality of the body, particularly the historically marginalized female body, we restore both the credibility of experience and the integrity of knowledge itself. Knowledge, once disembodied, can finally remember. In the vast landscape of philosophical thought, Simone de Beauvoir's assertion resounds with precision and discomfort. One is not born, but rather becomes, a woman. More pointedly, she observes that woman has historically existed not as an autonomous subject but as the other, defined and constructed in relation to man. This formulation is not merely rhetorical. It exposes the structural mechanics of gendered power, showing how women's identities, roles, and voices have been systematically subordinated. To be the other is to occupy a space defined by absence, reflection, and dependency. A space where one's essence is contingent upon an external standard. In this chapter, we will explore how the philosophical construction of woman as the other entrenches gender hierarchies, permeates knowledge systems, and shapes social norms that continue to reverberate into the present. The concept of the other is deceptively simple. It refers to the figure against which a dominant identity is defined. In the case of gender, man has been positioned as the default, the norm, the neutral subject whose experiences, desires, and intellect are considered universal. Woman, by contrast, is defined negatively, as deviation, as absence, as lack. She is not the originator of concepts but a mirror through which male subjectivity perceives itself. Every quality attributed to her is relative. She is understood primarily as the complement, the counterpoint, the inverse, or the shadow of man. This framing is structurally embedded. It is not contingent on individual thinkers alone but woven into the history of Western metaphysics, epistemology, and ethics. Beauvoir illustrates this through meticulous critique of classical philosophy. Plato, Aristotle, and Kant all construct a world where the ideal subject is disembodied, rational, and autonomous, implicitly male. The female is often described in terms of lack or excess, too emotional, too corporeal, too relational. Aristotle's assertion that woman is a mutilated male is emblematic of this. The female body, intellect, and moral disposition are understood as deficient versions of a male archetype. Woman is never conceived on her own terms. She exists only as a reflection of what man is not. Even when praised, she is praised for qualities that complement male dominance: beauty, nurturing, docility. These virtues are only intelligible in relation to male-centered ideals. This construction extends beyond abstract theory into the lived realities of social and political life. By defining woman as the other, patriarchal systems legitimize her exclusion from authority, decision-making, and intellectual discourse. Women's labor, thought, and creativity are often invisible precisely because they exist outside the domain of the recognized autonomous subject. Education, law, and science are structured around male norms, and the female is always measured against these norms, never allowed to establish independent criteria of worth or capability. The other is, by definition, derivative. Her contributions are only recognized when they align with or illuminate the dominant framework. The implications are both epistemic and ethical. Epistemically, the marginalization of the female perspective produces a knowledge system that is incomplete, biased, and limited. The experiences, insights, and intelligence of half the population are systematically filtered through male interpretive frameworks. Ethical systems, meanwhile, are built on a presumption of universality that is itself male-coded. The principles of autonomy, justice, and rationality, often assumed to be universally applicable, are, in practice, shaped by male experiences and priorities. The other, in Beauvoir's terms, is rendered incapable of full moral and political subjectivity because she is conceptually denied the status of origin, of agent, of author. Beauvoir does not treat this construction as an isolated philosophical quirk. She traces its historical persistence and cultural manifestations. In literature, art, and religion, women are consistently represented as supplementary figures. The virgin, the temptress, the muse, each role defines woman in reference to male desire, fear, or ambition. She is never the narrator, rarely the architect of her destiny. Even when she speaks, her words are framed through the expectation of her otherness. She must explain herself, justify her presence, or mediate between her desires and the demands of a male-centered world. In this sense, the other is structurally voiceless, except as she reflects or reacts to the dominant subject. Psychologically, this positioning has profound effects. Internalizing the status of other produces a dual consciousness. One rooted in the lived experience of the self, the other shaped by how one is perceived by the dominant group. Women learn to anticipate judgment, to modify expression, to navigate the gap between selfhood and societal expectation. This internalized tension is familiar to many, the feeling that one's genuine thoughts are insufficient, that one's presence must be justified, that one's value is contingent. Philosophically, Beauvoir links this psychic phenomenon to structural power. The other is not simply defined externally. She participates, often unconsciously, in the very dynamics that constrain her. The historical construction of woman as other is not static. It intersects with race, class, sexuality, and culture, producing compounded hierarchies. Intersectional perspectives reveal how women of color, lower-class women, or those outside normative sexualities are doubly or triply marginalized, their experiences rendered even more peripheral in systems built to privilege white, upper-class, heterosexual male subjectivity. The other is thus a position of layered exclusion, where epistemic invisibility and social vulnerability reinforce each other. Yet the other is not merely passive. Beauvoir emphasizes that recognition of this position is a prerequisite for autonomy. To understand oneself as other is to see the structural forces that shape perception, opportunity, and self-conception. Such awareness opens the door to resistance, challenging norms, asserting independent authority, and redefining criteria of value. Feminist praxis, in Beauvoir's terms, emerges from this recognition. The struggle is not merely for inclusion within existing structures but for transformation of the structures themselves, so that the other can become a subject, an origin, a source of thought rather than a reflection. Consider contemporary examples. In corporate leadership, women often find themselves measured against male-coded standards of decisiveness, assertiveness, and rationality. Their achievements are scrutinized differently, their mistakes amplified, their successes framed as exceptions. In politics, women may be celebrated for their charisma or empathy while simultaneously penalized for the same qualities in contexts dominated by male norms. The other is continually called upon to navigate and reconcile her identity with standards not of her own making. In epistemology, women scholars encounter similar dynamics. Research topics associated with care, domestic labor, emotional intelligence, or relational systems are frequently undervalued, dismissed as anecdotal, or deemed insufficiently rigorous. The other's insights, rooted in her positionality and experience, are often marginalized because the evaluative frameworks themselves assume a disembodied, male-coded subject. Knowledge production thus continues to be shaped by the dynamics Beauvoir identified, where authority, credibility, and relevance are measured against standards established by those historically positioned as normative. Literature and art offer additional illustrations. The trope of woman as the muse, rather than the creator, persists in modern media. Female protagonists are often defined by relationships to male characters, their narratives framed around male desire, fear, or moral development. Even when women are central, their inner lives are mediated through interpretive frameworks that prioritize male experience, echoing centuries-old philosophical constructions of otherness. Resistance emerges through critique, creativity, and redefinition. Feminist writers, artists, and philosophers challenge the default norms, asserting the legitimacy of perspectives and experiences historically relegated to the margins. By foregrounding their subjectivity, they reveal the contingency of supposedly universal standards. The other begins to reclaim agency not by becoming like the normative male, but by asserting the validity of her distinct positionality. This act undermines the structural assumptions that have historically rendered her peripheral, transforming the philosophical landscape itself. Simone de Beauvoir's conceptualization of woman as other is therefore both diagnosis and strategy. It diagnoses centuries of systematic subordination, the epistemic erasure of female perspectives, and the cultural framing of woman as deviation from the norm. Simultaneously, it offers a strategy. Consciousness of one's position is the first step toward autonomy and structural transformation. The other, once recognized as other, can begin to assert presence, authority, and originality, challenging the very foundations of her marginalization. In conclusion, the construction of woman as the other is foundational to the philosophy of gendered power. It situates male experience as universal while relegating female experience to the periphery, structurally embedding inequality in epistemology, ethics, and social organization. Yet recognition of this status also provides the tools for critique, resistance, and transformation. To confront the other is to confront the architecture of oppression itself, to reveal the assumptions that have long defined authority, knowledge, and value. Only by acknowledging and dismantling these constructions can woman move from reflection to origin, from absence to presence, and from object to subject within the philosophical and social order. Philosophical canons, those towering edifices of reason and logic, are rarely questioned for their completeness. They appear seamless, monolithic, and timeless. Yet beneath the polished surface, fissures have always existed, cracks that reveal omission, bias, and structural fragility. These are not superficial imperfections. They are the imprints of exclusions, erasures, and silences. Feminist thinkers did not seek polite admission into these canonical halls. They arrived like storms, wielding critique as sledgehammers, irony as scalpel, and imagination as a weapon. This chapter examines how these cracks expose the limitations of traditional philosophy, revealing that what appeared universal, objective, and complete was, in fact, contingent, partial, and deeply gendered. The first observation is obvious once seen. The canon speaks overwhelmingly from a single perspective. Plato, Descartes, Kant, Hegel. These thinkers, celebrated for their universality, constructed knowledge systems rooted in male experience. The assumption of neutrality was in itself gendered. Rationality, abstraction, disembodied reasoning, these were treated as universal norms, but they were implicitly coded as masculine. Within these frameworks, women's perspectives were marginalized, deemed anecdotal or emotional, their presence largely symbolic. Even when women are mentioned, it is rarely in a role of thought origin. They appear as muses, exemplars of temptation, or metaphors for natural processes. The cracks in the canon are therefore the silent spaces where female voices, experience, and intelligence have been deliberately or unconsciously erased. Feminist philosophers like Irigaray, Julia Kristeva, and Simone de Beauvoir did not merely seek inclusion within this framework. They exposed the framework itself. Their approach is neither apologetic nor conciliatory. Irigaray, for instance, scrutinized the language of philosophy, revealing that meaning was structured to exclude women before words were even spoken. The syntax, the metaphors, the very organization of knowledge were coded for male intelligibility. Every term, every premise, subtly reinforced the othering of women, ensuring that the canon remained ostensibly neutral while effectively silencing half of humanity. Kristeva extended this critique by focusing on what the system tried to suppress: affect, desire, embodiment, and disruption. She demonstrated that suppressed forces always resurface, often in forms the canonical system cannot assimilate, revealing the fragility of its claim to universality. Consider the technique itself. Exposing cracks is often subversive, playful, and paradoxical. Feminist thinkers employ irony, paradox, and contradiction to highlight the gaps and inconsistencies in established philosophy. When Beauvoir writes of woman as the other, she simultaneously accepts and subverts canonical definitions, using the system's own language to show its incompleteness. She demonstrates that the canon is less an unassailable structure of truth and more a fortress built on selective erasure. The cracks are not failures of reasoning per se, they are the result of structural exclusion, and once illuminated, they reveal the underlying partiality of philosophical authority. This structural critique extends into epistemology. The canon's claim to objectivity relies on a selective filtration of experience. Male thought is treated as generalizable. Female experience is treated as exceptional or anecdotal. Feminist critique exposes this filtration as deliberate and systemic. Knowledge appears coherent only because it has been curated through a lens that privileges certain bodies, certain social positions, and certain modes of cognition. The cracks, then, are the spaces where alternative experiences, female, marginalized, or otherwise excluded, challenge the coherence of what had been assumed to be complete. One of the most striking consequences of this subversion is the destabilization of authority. The canon often relies on the appearance of timeless certainty. Arguments are presented in abstraction, in neutral voice, as if conclusions are inevitable. Feminist critique disrupts this appearance. By inserting historically marginalized perspectives, questioning foundational assumptions, and drawing attention to gaps and exclusions, feminist thinkers demonstrate that authority is contingent. It depends on who has been allowed to speak and whose experiences have been recognized. The cracks in the canon, once revealed, show that the authority of reason is neither universal nor absolute. It is socially and historically constructed. The psychological dimension is equally profound. The canonical texts communicate more than abstract principles. They encode norms, expectations, and hierarchies. When feminist thinkers expose the cracks, they reveal that these texts also function as instruments of socialization. Readers internalize what is praised, omitted, and normalized. By highlighting the exclusions, feminist philosophy challenges not only intellectual structures but also ingrained cognitive and emotional patterns. Women, long accustomed to being othered, begin to see the mechanisms of their own marginalization. Men, similarly, confront the artificial universality of their assumed norms. The cracks are thus sites of revelation, reflection, and, potentially, transformation. Examples abound in the canon. Aristotle's biological and ethical texts portray women as incomplete or subordinate, a deficiency defined in relation to male norms. Kant presumes rationality and autonomy as the default mode of being, implicitly coding women as less capable of moral agency. Hegel's dialectical system situates women outside the development of self-consciousness, denying them subjectivity in a historical and philosophical narrative. Each of these is a fissure waiting for illumination. Feminist critique operates as light and pressure simultaneously. It exposes what was hidden and demonstrates the unsustainability of exclusion. The literary dimension of cracks is also notable. Feminist interventions often blend philosophy, narrative, and personal reflection to convey gaps that abstract argument alone cannot capture. Beauvoir's The Second Sex oscillates between meticulous historical analysis, critical engagement with canonical texts, and vivid depiction of lived experience. This multidimensional method exposes not only logical gaps but also the human consequences of philosophical exclusion. The cracks are thus made tangible. They are structural, epistemic, and lived. Humor and irony frequently accompany feminist interventions. By highlighting the absurdities of supposedly universal reasoning, thinkers like Irigaray demonstrate the arbitrary nature of gendered assumptions. For instance, when classical philosophy idealizes disembodied rationality, feminist critique shows how this abstraction is itself a metaphorical denial of feminine-associated qualities: emotion, relationality, embodiment. What appears formal and rigorous is revealed as socially coded, contingent, and partial. The cracks in the canon are amplified precisely because the system claims perfection while perpetuating systematic omissions. Resistance is an ongoing, iterative process. Cracks in the canon do not remain static. They expand, shift, and resonate across disciplines. Feminist philosophy, literary criticism, and social theory continually interrogate assumptions, revisit texts, and reconstruct meaning. Each intervention reveals that the canon is not an immutable monument but a living archive, vulnerable to reinterpretation, challenge, and transformation. The fissures are therefore not merely marks of past oversight, they are openings, opportunities, and catalysts for change. Importantly, these cracks also reveal intersections with race, class, and sexuality. Early feminist critique often centered on the experiences of white, educated women, but contemporary perspectives illuminate layered exclusions. The canon, historically constructed by elite male voices, marginalizes not only women but also people of color, working-class individuals, and LGBTQ+ thinkers. Feminist exposure of cracks must therefore contend with multiple axes of power and exclusion, demonstrating that the canon's apparent universality obscures profound inequalities. Philosophically, cracks in the canon challenge foundational notions of truth, reason, and objectivity. If the texts assumed to be definitive are partial, then claims to universality must be reevaluated. Feminist critique shows that what appeared neutral is historically contingent, culturally specific, and epistemically partial. By attending to omissions, exclusions, and silences, thinkers reclaim intellectual space and assert the legitimacy of alternative forms of knowledge. The cracks thus operate both as diagnostic tools and as instruments of liberation. Finally, the cracks are profoundly ethical. Exposing the limitations of canonical authority entails a commitment to justice, recognizing who has been silenced, who has been marginalized, and who has been erased. It is a moral intervention as much as an intellectual one, connecting the critique of ideas to the lived realities of those historically excluded. By challenging the canon, feminist thinkers demand accountability, reflection, and transformation, both within philosophy and across society. In conclusion, cracks in the canon is not merely an observation of imperfection, it is an assertion of possibility. Feminist thought reveals that the philosophical canon is not a flawless edifice but a constructed and contestable archive, whose authority rests on exclusion as much as inclusion. The fissures expose assumptions, biases, and erasures, inviting re-evaluation of universality, neutrality, and completeness. These cracks are sites of revelation, resistance, and reconstruction. By illuminating them, feminist thinkers reclaim the space of thought, asserting that philosophy, knowledge, and society are enriched when the voices long silenced are allowed to speak. The canon's cracks are thus simultaneously evidence of past injustice and openings for transformative reimagining, a space where philosophy can begin to reflect the full spectrum of human experience rather than a narrowly defined, historically contingent ideal. Philosophy as a discipline, often presents itself as orderly, rational, and comprehensive. Yet, history reveals a profound contradiction. That which is repressed, especially the voices, experiences, and intelligence of women, does not vanish. It returns. It returns not as an orderly addition or as a polite footnote, but in uncontrolled, unpredictable, and disruptive forms. Julia Kristeva, in her incisive explorations of language, subjectivity, and the unconscious, emphasizes that female experience, when excluded, resurfaces through what she terms the semiotic, the prelinguistic, bodily, and affective registers of expression. These returns are never neutral. They challenge systems, destabilize certainty, and illuminate the incompleteness of any structure that attempted to erase them. This chapter traces how the suppressed female, the woman denied a voice, re-enters discourse through language, trauma, dreams, and the unconscious, asserting presence precisely where it was forbidden. From the outset, it is crucial to acknowledge the patterns of repression. In canonical philosophy, women were rarely addressed as full subjects of thought. They existed as metaphors, symbols, and occasional exemplars of deficiency. Aristotle, for instance, codified women as biologically incomplete, their rational capacities limited by nature. Kant, in his ethical frameworks, often assumed rationality as a male property, implicitly situating women outside the domain of autonomous moral agents. Across centuries, similar exclusions proliferated. Women's intellectual contributions were ignored, marginalized, or reframed as curiosities rather than authoritative insights. By systematically denying women's subjectivity, the philosophical tradition attempted to enforce silence. Yet Kristeva reminds us that what is denied cannot be fully contained. Repression merely displaces expression into alternative, often disruptive, channels. Language is the first medium through which the repressed returns. For Kristeva, the semiotic dimension of language, the rhythms, tonalities, intonations, and bodily resonances that precede structured syntax, carries traces of the excluded. Women's voices, when constrained by social and philosophical norms, seep into discourse not as coherent argumentation but as disruption, modulation, and inflection. Consider, for example, the ways in which literary expression, poetry, or even fragmented speech patterns encode experiences that cannot be rationalized within canonical frameworks. These linguistic traces are unpredictable. They resist total capture, they subvert meaning, and they expose the limitations of rationalist assumptions. Philosophers who prize objectivity, clarity, and abstraction often fail to recognize this as knowledge. Yet it is precisely through these uncontrolled forms that suppressed experience asserts itself. Trauma is another vector for return. The historical silencing of women is not merely an intellectual exclusion. It carries real psychological and corporeal consequences. Women subjected to systemic repression, be it social, institutional, or philosophical, internalize constraint, only to later exhibit responses that challenge order and control. Kristeva notes that trauma circulates through language, dreams, bodily expression, and social interaction. The return of the repressed manifests in unexpected emotional intensity, in dissident speech, in art that defies formal conventions. These phenomena are often pathologized, labeled as hysteria, irrationality, or neurosis, yet they are, in fact, evidence of the persistence of suppressed knowledge and experience. In this sense, the repressed returns as both signal and critique. It exposes the gap between philosophical abstraction and lived reality, between universal claims and structural exclusion. Dreams offer a particularly vivid site for this uncontrolled return. In the unconscious, repressed material bypasses the strictures of rational ordering. Women's experience, long unacknowledged, emerges in symbolic, enigmatic, or fragmentary forms. Dreams may dramatize absence, injustice, or relational power imbalances. They may manifest conflict, desire, or resistance. They may express grief, rage, or creativity that rational systems have deemed irrelevant. Importantly, these nocturnal returns are not contained, predictable, or easily assimilated. They disrupt, interrogate, and demand engagement, revealing that exclusion can never be final. The system of reason, no matter how authoritative, cannot fully immunize itself against what has been pushed to the margins. Kristeva's semiotic theory illuminates the interplay between repression and return in broader societal terms. Excluded female experience infiltrates institutions, art, and discourse through modes that are rhythmic, affective, and nonlinear. This infiltration is unsettling precisely because it resists codification and control. It manifests as cultural critique, social movement, experimental literature, and philosophical challenge. The unpredictability of these returns destabilizes norms, revealing that the appearance of completeness in male-dominated discourse is illusory. Each eruption, whether in language, emotion, or artistic expression, is a crack in the armor of patriarchal knowledge, a reminder that silenced voices will assert themselves when and how they choose. Historical examples reinforce the recurring nature of these uncontrolled forms. Consider the emergence of women writers and thinkers in periods and societies that ostensibly silenced them. Mary Wollstonecraft's A Vindication of the Rights of Woman entered a discourse dominated by male rationalists, yet it refused integration on their terms. Wollstonecraft's language was assertive, unapologetic, and morally urgent, an unpredictable return of suppressed perspective. Similarly, Simone de Beauvoir in The Second Sex combined meticulous historical analysis with reflective prose, exposing centuries of erasure while demonstrating the active presence of what had been denied. These intellectual and literary interventions exemplify Kristeva's insight. The repressed returns in forms that challenge, disrupt, and reconfigure existing frameworks. It is worth noting that uncontrolled returns are not merely external critiques. They also function internally within the minds of those engaged in repression. Male philosophers who attempted to exclude women were themselves confronted with what they sought to deny. Their texts, imbued with fear of disorder, anxiety over desire, and unease with embodiment, betray moments where repression fails. Freud's descriptions of female psychology, for instance, oscillate between pathologization and fascination, revealing the instability at the core of purportedly objective accounts. Kristeva emphasizes that repression is a dynamic interaction, producing returns that unsettle both the silenced and the silencer. In this sense, uncontrolled forms are both intervention and mirror. They challenge structural authority while revealing the psychological costs of exclusion. The unpredictability of return is a crucial aspect. Unlike rational argumentation, the semiotic, the traumatic, and the dreamlike cannot be scheduled, codified, or fully anticipated. These returns operate according to their own logic, informed by affect, embodiment, and history. Kristeva's insight into the semiotic underscores that these processes are inherently disruptive. The system's rules, assumptions, and hierarchies are insufficient to contain them. Every unexpected insight, every narrative that defies orthodox structures, every emotional or bodily expression that resists categorization is evidence of the ongoing presence of what was once excluded. Moreover, these returns carry transformative potential. By infiltrating established discourse, suppressed female experience forces reconsideration of foundational assumptions. Language, reason, morality, and epistemology must accommodate forms that do not fit neatly within existing structures. Philosophical authority, once assumed universal, becomes contingent. Rationalist abstraction, once considered neutral, is revealed as partial. The repressed returns as both critique and opportunity, demanding that knowledge systems recognize the validity and complexity of previously marginalized voices. These returns also underscore the ethical dimension of inclusion. Kristeva reminds us that the silencing of women is not merely an intellectual oversight but a structural injustice. When excluded perspectives reappear, they illuminate the consequences of exclusion, compelling accountability. The uncontrolled nature of return embodies both resistance and reclamation. It refuses assimilation on terms defined by the oppressor and insists on recognition in its own terms. To engage with these forms is to confront the ethical imperative of acknowledging and valuing the historically silenced. Artistic and cultural expressions provide tangible examples of these returns. From modernist literature to contemporary feminist theory, the echoes of suppressed female experience emerge in fractured narratives, disrupted syntax, and experimental forms. Virginia Woolf's stream of consciousness, Audre Lorde's poetic urgency, and Toni Morrison's layered storytelling illustrate the multiplicity of ways that repression resurfaces. These works challenge the linearity, objectivity, and abstraction favored by canonical philosophy, offering alternative epistemologies rooted in experience, embodiment, and affective complexity. In these contexts, uncontrolled return is not only a philosophical concept but a lived, perceivable reality. Even scientific and academic domains cannot fully escape these dynamics. Women's contributions in mathematics, science, and philosophy have often been minimized, misattributed, or excluded from dominant narratives. Yet their influence emerges through revisionist histories, recovered manuscripts, and reinterpretation of experiments and theories. These recoveries, whether accidental, deliberate, or serendipitous, mirror the unpredictable return of suppressed knowledge. Exclusion cannot eliminate the influence of insight, and the system's attempt at control only heightens the impact of these unanticipated resurgences. Finally, the broader social implication is profound. The returns of the suppressed remind us that attempts to enforce rigid hierarchies and exclusions are ultimately unstable. Authority, objectivity, and knowledge are not fixed. They are contested, contingent, and shaped by power dynamics. By observing how female experience infiltrates, disrupts, and transforms systems, we gain insight into the mechanisms of oppression and resistance. Kristeva's work teaches that repression creates the conditions for its own challenge, that exclusion generates the forces of its undoing. The uncontrolled forms of return are both inevitable and necessary. They are the vectors through which history, knowledge, and social structures evolve. In conclusion, she returns in uncontrolled forms, illuminates the persistent, unpredictable, and transformative ways in which excluded female experience reasserts itself. Through language, trauma, dreams, and embodied presence, the repressed infiltrates the systems that sought to deny it. These returns destabilize authority, challenge abstraction, and insist upon recognition. They are not merely echoes of what was silenced. They are active forces, revealing the contingency of knowledge, the limitations of canonical authority, and the enduring power of marginalized voices. To ignore these returns is to ignore history, psychology, and the ethical demands of recognition. To engage with them is to participate in the ongoing reconstruction of thought itself, ensuring that philosophy, society, and knowledge accommodate the full spectrum of human experience. To imagine women as the origin of thought is not merely an intellectual exercise, it is a radical reconfiguration of philosophy, epistemology, and social imagination. For centuries, women have been relegated to the periphery, not subjects of inquiry themselves but objects, metaphors, obstacles, or temptations within the frameworks constructed predominantly by men. Their absence, or symbolic presence, has defined the parameters of knowledge, authority, and rationality. What if we reversed this? What if, instead of being the problem to be solved or the other to be contained, Women became the active, generative source of thought, of ideas, of knowledge itself. To pursue this thought experiment is to confront both historical injustice and the potentialities of a radically different intellectual world. From the outset, it is important to acknowledge how deeply entrenched the exclusion has been. Philosophical systems from Plato through Freud were designed around a particular conception of rationality, abstraction, and control, qualities coded as male. Women were frequently associated with the body, emotion, desire, or chaos, all of which were positioned outside the boundaries of legitimate thought. Aristotle, for example, dismissed women as biologically deficient, inherently incomplete, a lesser form of human being. Kant's ethical universe largely assumed male rational autonomy as the universal standard, implicitly relegating women to a secondary moral status. Even when women were written about or cited, they were often interpreted through male eyes, transformed into symbols of deficiency, danger, or moral caution. Across centuries, this created a pattern. Women were not recognized as thinkers in their own right. If women were repositioned as sources of thought, this historical pattern would be fundamentally disrupted. The first shift would be epistemological. The criteria for what counts as knowledge would be expanded. Knowledge is not neutral, it is socially, politically, and culturally constructed. By including women as active sources, the very assumptions about universality, objectivity, and rationality would be challenged. Subjectivity, once devalued because it was coded as feminine, would no longer be marginalized. Experience, emotion, intuition, and relationality could be treated not as obstacles to clarity, but as valid avenues of insight. Knowledge would no longer be defined by detachment from life, from embodiment, from relational context. It would be richer, more complex, and more accurate in capturing human reality. Consider the implications in philosophy itself. If women were acknowledged as originators of thought, classical philosophical problems might have been framed differently or not at all. The dualisms that dominate Western thought, reason versus emotion, mind versus body, universal versus particular, might have been reconceived. For instance, the mind-body divide that has justified centuries of gendered exclusion could have been bridged through perspectives that integrate feeling and cognition, intuition and analysis, care and logic. Ethical systems would need to account for experience previously deemed secondary or irrelevant. Political philosophy would be informed by the realities of those historically excluded from the social contract. Feminist philosophy, in this sense, is not a marginal corrective. It is a demonstration of what becomes possible when women are treated as generators of knowledge rather than objects of observation. The shift also has psychological dimensions. To treat women as sources of thought requires challenging deeply internalized biases. Male philosophers who constructed abstract, supposedly universal systems often projected their fears, insecurities, and unacknowledged desires onto women. Women became other, not because of intrinsic qualities, but because the exclusion served to stabilize fragile systems of male authority and identity. Recognizing women as originators of thought destabilizes those defensive structures. It requires acknowledging the depth and complexity of feminine intellect and imagination, including capacities for synthesis, ambiguity, relational reasoning, and creative disruption. It entails confronting discomfort, uncertainty, and the historically constructed hierarchy that has long privileged a narrow form of reason. Literature and history provide glimpses of this potential. Women like Hypatia, Hildegard of Bingen, Mary Wollstonecraft, Simone de Beauvoir, and Helene Sixus illustrate the generative force of thought that was often resisted, suppressed, or ignored. Hypatia's mathematical and astronomical contributions were erased from dominant narratives. Wollstonecraft's revolutionary arguments were framed as moral excess, Beauvoir's critical interventions exposed centuries of constructed otherness. Sixus argued for writing the body and the feminine into discourse itself. In each case, women generated ideas that reconfigured the intellectual landscape, even when they were marginalized or attacked. These historical examples hint at what might have been possible had women always been recognized as sources rather than objects. Becoming the source also transforms the ethical and social imaginary. If women are originators of thought, then the metrics of value, authority, and legitimacy must shift. Power would be reinterpreted. It would no longer derive solely from exclusion, domination, or control over knowledge. Authority would emerge from engagement, dialogue, creativity, and insight. Social structures, educational, political, familial, would be reconceived to cultivate rather than suppress diverse voices. In practice, this might mean reorganizing institutions, curricula, and decision-making processes to center historically excluded perspectives. It might mean reconceiving merit, achievement, and recognition to account for previously invisible contributions. The very notion of what counts as important knowledge would expand. One might ask, what would this mean for philosophy as a discipline? Philosophical writing might shift from purely analytical frameworks to forms that embrace multiplicity, ambiguity, and relationality. Argumentation could integrate intuition and embodiment as legitimate modes of reasoning. Epistemology would recognize knowledge as contingent, situated, and socially informed, rather than abstractly universal. Ethics would be grounded in lived experience as well as principle. Political thought would be informed by the perspectives of those historically excluded, rather than projected onto them. In all of these cases, the intellectual landscape is profoundly enriched when women are recognized as sources of thought rather than objects to be categorized, symbolized, or controlled. Moreover, the imaginative and creative implications are immense. Literature, art, science, and technology would be transformed by this reorientation. Innovation often arises at the boundaries between what is permitted and what is suppressed. By validating female thought as generative, societies open space for ideas that challenge conventional structures. Artistic and literary forms might become more experimental, more inclusive of affective and relational dimensions. Scientific inquiry would integrate diverse experiences and approaches, reducing blind spots and expanding understanding. The sheer scope of human creativity is multiplied when historically silenced voices are acknowledged and empowered. Of course, becoming the source is not simply a matter of representation. It is not enough to insert women into pre-existing structures or to invite them to participate on terms set by male-dominated frameworks. True transformation requires restructuring the epistemological and social systems themselves. This is why thinkers like Irigaray, Beauvoir, and Sixus insist that women's thought must be recognized on its own terms, with its own logic, rhythm, and methodology. The source is generative precisely because it is autonomous. It produces new forms of knowledge, new categories, new metaphors, and new ethical frameworks. Attempting to assimilate it into old paradigms risks repeating historical erasure. The source must be allowed to flow, uncontained, shaping the terrain rather than merely inhabiting it. There are also personal, psychological dimensions. For women themselves, becoming the source entails reclaiming authority over their own experience and thought. It is a reversal of centuries of internalized limitation and self-censorship. To claim oneself as originator requires resisting the subtle, pervasive social cues that have long communicated inferiority, excess, or irrelevance. It involves asserting voice in spaces that have historically silenced, critiqued, or pathologized female expression. The act of becoming the source is simultaneously an individual and collective process. It is about reclaiming inner authority while reshaping the external systems that define legitimacy. The ethical stakes are equally profound. To recognize women as sources of thought is to confront complicity in historical injustice. It demands that we interrogate the assumptions embedded in our knowledge systems, our educational institutions, and our social hierarchies. It requires acknowledging the ways in which the absence of women's voices has shaped what counts as rational, valid, and authoritative. This recognition is not merely symbolic. It carries concrete implications for policy, pedagogy, and social organization. Becoming the source is an ethical imperative as much as an epistemological one. Historically, attempts to resist female thought have generated crises precisely because women's contributions have a destabilizing potential. Kristeva's insights into the semiotic, Beauvoir's critique of the other, and Sixtus's call to write the feminine into discourse all reflect the disruptive force inherent in women's thinking. When women are not acknowledged as sources, their impact still manifests, through literature, social movements, and cultural shifts, but in forms that are contested, misunderstood, or pathologized. To explicitly recognize women as originators allows this potential to be harnessed constructively, transforming disruption into generativity. Imagine then a world in which women are acknowledged as the source. Classrooms, laboratories, boardrooms, and philosophical forums are populated by autonomous female voices, shaping questions, methods, and interpretations. Knowledge becomes polyphonic rather than monolithic. Systems of evaluation and authority adapt to accommodate relational, embodied, and contextually grounded reasoning. Cultural narratives shift to incorporate complexity, ambiguity, and multiplicity. The result is not chaos, but richness, a landscape of thought that reflects the full spectrum of human experience, unbounded by historical exclusions. Ultimately, becoming the source is about reclaiming agency, knowledge, and creativity. It is about dismantling the centuries-long construction of women as problem, other, or metaphor, and recognizing the generative potential that has always existed, even under conditions of repression. To imagine women as originators of thought is to imagine a world in which philosophy, science, ethics, and art are transformed, not simply by addition but by fundamental reconception. The exercise is at once radical, practical, and deeply ethical. It challenges the very definition of knowledge, authority, and truth. It demands engagement, reflection, and the courage to reconstruct our intellectual frameworks from the ground up. In conclusion, envisioning women as the source of thought is a call to action, a philosophical intervention, and a profound shift in perspective. It is the culmination of the struggles chronicled in the preceding chapters, the silencing, marginalization, and symbolic reduction of women. It is also a projection of possibility, a world in which exclusion no longer defines the boundaries of knowledge, and where the richness, complexity, and autonomy of women's thought is recognized as fundamental. This is not merely an intellectual exercise, it is a radical reimagining of human understanding itself, one that restores women to their rightful position at the origin of ideas, the creators of knowledge, and the shapers of worlds yet to be imagined. As we slowly drift away from the dense corridors of thought we have just traversed, let us take a moment to look back and gently acknowledge the journey we have shared. Over 15 chapters, we have walked together through shadows and reflections, confronting the silences that shaped the minds of countless women, and tracing the subtle ways philosophy and psychology have both confined and misunderstood them. We began by noticing the quiet, the absence of voices that were never meant to speak, and the weight of that silence on centuries of ideas. We observed how abstraction, a tool once heralded as clarity, too often became a screen behind which the living, breathing realities of women were hidden. We have explored the ways in which bodies, emotions, and desires were misread or dismissed, how missing elements were interpreted as deficiencies, and how the very presence of women was framed as disruption or danger. We traced the lines from Plato's ethereal forms to Schopenhauer's stark dismissals, through Nietzsche's anxious warnings, and into Freud's dark continents of mind, discovering that each declaration, each theory, was not only a reflection of the times but also a mirror of their author's own fears, limitations, and defenses. And yet, within this constriction, we also glimpsed the seeds of resistance. The voices of Beauvoir, Irigaray, Kristeva, and others, emerging, bending, and gently cracking the hard surfaces of tradition, reminding us that the excluded were never truly absent, merely deferred. It is tempting at this point to linger on outrage, on the weight of what was denied, the dimensions of what was never recognized. But let us instead allow these observations to settle like soft sediment in still water. Each injustice, each misreading, each act of erasure has also highlighted the possibility of seeing differently. The ways experience can redefine authority, the ways knowledge can expand when bodies, emotions, and subjectivities are allowed to speak. And so, we breathe in the complexity we have met, letting it fill us without fear, allowing the rhythm of understanding to slow, to soften. Perhaps you notice your own reflections mingling with these historical ones, your awareness of the subtle judgments and assumptions that have shaped your own life, the echoes of voices silenced or diminished around you. And it is okay. There is no need to rush past these thoughts, no need to solve or to act, not tonight. Simply acknowledge them as one might watch clouds drift across a dimly lit sky. Every chapter we read, every concept we considered, every paradox we observed, it is all now behind us, resting quietly, waiting without demand. As we continue, we can feel the pace slowing further. The sharp edges of critique soften into insight. The confrontations with past misjudgments become gentle illuminations of what has been overlooked, what can now be remembered, honored, and held without tension. You might feel your muscles relaxing, your heartbeat settling, your thoughts moving in long, unhurried currents. And with each exhale, the ideas we have carried gradually float away, leaving only a calm awareness of their shapes, of the patterns they formed in our minds, and the spaces they now leave for rest. Imagine, if you will, that all those voices we have met, the philosophers, the critics, the suppressed, the resistant, are fading into the background of your own consciousness, like a tapestry whose threads are now dimly glowing, weaving a pattern you can perceive but need not analyze. There is nothing urgent here, no question demanding immediate answer, only a gentle unfolding of comprehension, of awareness that does not weigh but simply exists. Each notion of silence, each moment of recognition, now becomes a lull, a pause, a tender invitation to let go. Feel your shoulders drop. Your hands release their hold on imagined tensions. Let the soft, quiet hum of reflection carry you further toward a gentle edge, a liminal space between thought and rest. The journey we took together was not about resolution or certainty, it was about presence, about witnessing, about allowing yourself to know and to feel without pressure. Even the darkest notions, even the most challenging truths, can now settle into a kind of luminous calm. And so, as the mind eases, let us imagine a soft night outside, a gentle breeze brushing against leaves, the distant murmur of a river. All those debates, all those silences, all those insights, they now drift like clouds across this night sky, dissolving without effort, leaving room for quiet, for breathing, for the natural rhythm of rest. You are safe in this awareness, carried by it rather than burdened by it, and there is nothing left to do but observe the gentle unfolding of evening, the soft descent of thought into the comforting embrace of stillness. Let the last remnants of tension melt into warmth. Allow your eyelids to become heavy, your breath to lengthen, your mind to sink into a rhythm that needs nothing from you but gentle attention. The story of ideas, the dance of voices, the slow unspooling of history, all of it is here, held in the quiet spaces within you. And now, slowly, softly, as the patterns fade and the last lights dim in your awareness, let sleep begin its careful weaving, wrapping you in gentle shadows and calm certainty. You have journeyed far in thought. You have witnessed, reflected, and perhaps recognized parts of yourself in the margins of history. And now it is time to rest. Tonight, let the mind release its weight, the body settle into softness, and the heart embrace the quiet. There is no hurry, no demand, only the slow rhythmic cadence of breath and the lull of night. Let the darkness be gentle, the silence kind, and the coming dreams restful. Good night.